Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I jerked awake, heart pounding, to the abrupt sound of something knocking behind the wall. It was neither a casual thump nor the distant echo of settling timbers. It was deliberate, 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, as though a knuckle tapped against the gypsum in a cold, calculated rhythm. My mind, groggy from incomplete sleep, first registered confusion, then dread. This was not the first time I'd heard it, but it was the first time it felt personal, like an insistent signal calling specifically for me. The hush of the early morning, broken only by my own ragged breathing, magnified every scrape and rustle of my bedding. I felt trapped by that sound, pinned in place by my own fear, heart hammering so fiercely I could practically hear blood rushing in my ears. I've never been a particularly superstitious man, but on nights like that, confronted with the inexplicable, I realized how unprepared I was for anything that defied logic. My bedroom is not large, and the wall in question is at arm's length from the side of my bed. It's a standard interior partition made of gypsum board, leading to a dusty storage space that was originally meant for seasonal items. Over the years, though, that cramped area behind the bedroom became a place I barely acknowledged, a void where I tossed forgotten boxes and seldom used equipment. When the knocking first started, I rationalized it as the house settling or a faulty pipe, but each time the pattern was too deliberate. It was no mere coincidence. That early morning, my curiosity got the better of me. With my hand trembling, I decided to respond. I tapped the wall, 3 knocks back, copying the pattern as accurately as I could. The instant reply, 3 equally spaced knocks, sent a jolt of electric terror through my entire body. My legs were rigid beneath the blanket, and my throat felt as if it had closed shut. Despite every instinct telling me to remain absolutely still, I lurched upright and flicked on the bedside lamp. The sudden brightness was both a relief and an intrusion, spotlighting every corner of my cluttered bedroom but offering no explanation for the sound. The knocking had ceased, replaced by my shallow, panicked breathing. Over the next few hours, I lay in bed with the lamp on, waiting for dawn. A part of me wanted to believe the entire thing was a half-dream, a product of an overactive mind. Yet my senses were too alert, too raw. There was no dismissing the force of those knocks. When the first hint of daylight crept through the curtains, I got dressed and made my way to the other side of the wall. The storage area is accessed through a narrow door in the hallway. I pushed aside boxes, old tarps, and broken furniture until I stood at the exact spot where my bed was situated on the other side. Nothing. It was an empty corner layered with dust and cobwebs. No visible sign of tampering. No indication that any living thing could have stood there to produce those sounds. The wall was solid, the floor was intact, and there were no hidden passageways or unexpected openings. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that immediate response to my tapping. Later that morning, as I sipped coffee in the kitchen, my hands were unsteady. I recalled searching for any plausible explanation. Faulty pipes, electrical cables, or even rodents. But the pattern was too precise, too human-like. I felt a creeping sense of paranoia, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder even in your own home. I tried telling myself that the mind can play tricks in the silence of the night, but the small voice of reason in the back of my head refused to be silenced. Over the following days, I attempted to maintain a normal routine. I went to work, performed my tasks mechanically, and returned home each evening determined to distract myself. Yet each dusk brought with it a simmering anxiety, a dread that settled in my stomach like lead. I fought to stay awake, hoping that if I wasn't asleep, I wouldn't hear those knocks. But fatigue always won. Nearly every early morning, just as the world turned quiet, I'd jolt awake to those same crisp raps on the gypsum. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again. My heart would thunder in my chest, sweat forming on my forehead. Sometimes I could feel my pulse in my neck throbbing so violently it hurt. I would roll over, muscles tense, eyes locked on the wall. More than once, I forced myself to reach out and press my palm flat against the smooth surface, half expecting to feel a responding pressure from the other side. It never happened that way, but the knocks continued, never random, always following a pattern that reminded me of a code. I tried not to respond anymore, yet the urge to communicate, to confront whatever was doing this, gnawed at me. On the third night, the knocking escalated. Instead of 3 measured taps, it was 5 quick ones, as though whoever or whatever was behind the wall had grown agitated. The resonance felt stronger, more forceful, like someone striking with closed fists. When I pressed my ear against the gypsum, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The noise was disturbingly close, as if only a thin sheet separated me from a presence I didn't want to face. I didn't dare respond that time. I only lay there paralyzed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My thoughts raced, flipping between rational and irrational explanations with increasing desperation. Could it be wind trapped in the vents? But why would wind knock so deliberately? Could it be an animal? That made little sense as well. Nothing about this situation aligned with normal reality. Exhaustion and fear seemed to conspire against me. I felt a creeping chill, a sensation that the wall itself was alive, that something pressed against it from the other side, hungry to push through into my room. I avoided the storage space for a while, uneasy about what I might find, or fail to find, in that dark, cramped compartment. During the day, I felt a bit safer, shielded by sunlight and the mundane routines of life. At work, I mentioned unusual noises in my house to a colleague, but used vague, impersonal terms. I described them as weird sounds in the wall, but I left out the rhythmic aspect, the back and forth tapping. I didn't want to sound unhinged. My colleague suggested it could be a plumbing issue or some ventilation quirk. I nodded, feigning agreement, though I knew it was more than that. That weekend, I mustered the courage to systematically inspect the storage area. I spent hours in there, pulling out every box, shining a flashlight into every dusty corner. I nearly choked on the stale air, and my hands shook whenever I brushed aside a cobweb. My nerves were so frayed that each time the floor creaked under my feet, I jumped. Eventually, I located nothing but my own neglected junk. No cracks in the walls, no hidden compartments, no sign that something, or someone, could be physically present. By the time I was done, my skin was slick with cold sweat, and my heart was pounding like a drum. Yet I felt no closer to understanding. That night, I drifted off a little less terrified, having at least confirmed there was no actual person lurking behind that wall. But around 2 a.m, I was seized by a violent rapping. The frequency and force of it had grown. It wasn't just a code anymore. It was a harsh pounding, enough to shake the cheap drywall. My entire body went rigid, my throat dry. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, but my hand was trembling so badly that I knocked it over. For a few seconds, I was entombed in darkness, with nothing but my ragged breath and that menacing sound. When I finally managed to turn on the overhead light, the knocking stopped abruptly, as though switched off. The pause should have calmed me, but I found myself staring at a subtle bulge in the wall's surface. It looked infinitesimally more pronounced, like the gypsum had bowed outward. My breath caught. Had it always looked that way, or was it new? I was afraid to investigate closer, afraid to confirm that something was actually pushing from inside. My rational mind insisted it must be an optical illusion or my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the dread that twisted my insides. In the days that followed, my paranoia deepened. I started catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow in a doorway, a flicker of black in the hallway mirror. When I was in bed, I could swear I heard scraping sounds along the baseboards, faint as if from the next room. Sometimes it seemed to come from under the floor. My heart rate spiked whenever these sensations intruded, and I'd freeze, waiting for something to announce itself. Yet each time, the house fell back into silence. I began sleeping with the television on in the other room, hoping the low murmur of late-night programs would obscure any knocking. Despite that, I kept hearing it. Sometimes it was softer, more muffled, but it was definitely there. My heart would race each time, and my palms would sweat, making it difficult to grip my blankets. I felt the suffocating panic of someone trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. I found myself losing sense of time, drifting in and out of anxious half-sleep. My reflection in the bathroom mirror became gaunt, with dark circles under my eyes. My coworkers politely asked if I was getting enough rest, or if something was wrong. I only shook my head, giving evasive answers. One late evening, emboldened by frustration and the adrenaline of terror, I decided to record the sounds. I set up my phone's voice recorder on my nightstand and lay in bed, heart thumping like a drumbeat in my chest. For a while, there was only the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the creaks of the house settling. But after midnight, the knocks began, sharp and unmistakable. My breath caught, sweat beaded on my forehead. I forced myself to remain still, resisting every urge to jump up and turn on the light. The knocks continued for several minutes. When I finally played back the recording the next day, the pattern was so clear that my hair stood on end. There were also faint clicks and hisses in the background that I couldn't explain. It was as though multiple tones overlapped, forming a dissonant chorus of unnatural sound. At that point, I decided to reach out for help, in a half-hearted, indirect way. I contacted a local handyman I knew and described a possible structural issue in the wall. I said I was concerned about cracks or something behind the drywall. He came by in the afternoon, performing a cursory inspection. He found no sign of damage, no insects, no evidence of an animal infestation. He told me everything looked normal. Trying not to sound delusional, I explained there were unusual noises, maybe loose ductwork. He tapped the wall in a few places, listened with an expression of mild interest, and concluded that it was likely an isolated quirk of an older house. I didn't have the courage to tell him that the knocks responded in code, that they sometimes felt strong enough to break the wall. He packed his tools and left me alone with my confusion. That night, as soon as the witching hour approached, the tension in my body was almost unbearable. My breathing came in shallow spurts and my chest felt tight. The knocks started again, more insistent than ever. The wall literally vibrated under the impact, and my bed frame shook. My eyes locked on that subtle bulge in the drywall. It seemed bigger, like it had expanded outward by another fraction. My throat was parched, and a cold sweat trickled down my spine. My heart pounded so violently I worried it might fail me. I mustered enough resolve to push my nightstand aside, letting me stand right next to the wall. My hand reached out, trembling so fiercely I could feel each tremor in my elbow. I pressed my palm against the bulge. The surface was cold and unnervingly firm, as though something more solid than ordinary studs lay behind it. The pounding escalated, the repetitive thud matching my pulse. The wall felt like it had its own heartbeat. My mind spun with thoughts I couldn't fully articulate. I questioned my own sanity, considered the possibility that I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. Yet every time my skepticism wavered, the knocks intensified, mocking my doubt. I felt sure that this presence, be it supernatural or some twisted psychological echo, was determined to break through. At that point, every survival instinct screamed at me to leave. I hurried out of the bedroom, flipping on every light in the hallway. My entire body was trembling as I retreated to the living room, where I stood by the front door, keys in hand, uncertain whether to flee into the night or stand my ground. I swore I heard scraping footsteps within the wall, following me to the living room. The notion that it was hunting me from inside the house nearly made me drop my keys. Eventually, I steeled myself enough to go back. My plan was simply to grab some essentials from the bedroom and drive to a motel. Approaching that corridor felt like walking into a predator's lair. The lighting was dim, and every step made the floorboards complain. I could taste bile in my throat, my mouth bone dry despite my tongue feeling swollen. The corridor stretched out in my imagination, turning each footstep into an eternity. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the bedroom doorway. Inside, the silence was deafening. No knocks, no vibrations. Even the bulge in the wall looked less pronounced, Or maybe my eyes were deceiving me. The air felt heavy, suffused with a latent threat. I grabbed a handful of clothes, my phone charger, and some toiletries. I avoided looking at the wall, yet the urge to confront it, to see if it was still there, was overwhelming. My stomach cramped with dread. Finally, I forced my gaze over, half expecting the plaster to split or a shape to emerge. But it remained whole, unbroken. Still, that sense of being watched persisted, as if a malevolent presence lurked just behind the thin gypsum. I left the house shortly after, heart still pounding in my chest. The motel's fluorescent lights and bland decor offered a temporary reprieve from the terror that had taken root in my psyche. But even there, I kept glancing at the walls. I tried to calm myself by reasoning that if the knocking was some bizarre phenomenon tied to that one location, perhaps it would vanish if I stayed away. Yet the leftover tension refused to subside. My hands shook uncontrollably as I keyed into the motel room, and I triple-checked the locks. It was as if I expected to hear that same code-like tapping on the motel walls, no matter where I went. Later that night, I lay on the stiff mattress with the lights on, listening for anything that might suggest it had followed me. The motel remained silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. I tried to take comfort in that hush, but the memory of those insistent raps, the forceful pounding, kept replaying in my mind. Whenever I closed my eyes, I felt the cold gypsum against my palm, recalled the unnatural vibration that seemed to respond to my own fear. Sleep was elusive, fragmented by bouts of racing thoughts. By dawn, I was torn between dread and a stubborn determination to reclaim my life. I had no intention of selling my home or abandoning it forever. At the same time, the idea of returning filled me with a deep, nauseating anxiety. Yet I sensed that if I ran away, whatever was behind that wall would always haunt me, an unresolved nightmare lurking at the edges of my mind. I needed some form of closure, even if it meant confronting a presence I could barely comprehend. I haven't solved the mystery of those nocturnal knocks yet, but I've taken the first step by acknowledging, at least to myself, that something beyond normal explanation dwells in the space behind that gypsum board. Whether it's a manifestation of my own fear or an entity intent on breaching my reality, I can't be certain. All I know is that it waits in the darkness, calling to me through its coded taps. Each night, the fear returns, but so does a flicker of resolve. I stand now at the threshold of something impossible, aware that my next move could define my relationship with this unseen force. My only hope is that I can outlast it, that my conviction will hold firm while the wall stands unbroken. And if it ever does break through, if I ever find myself face to face with whatever lurks behind the gypsum, I pray that I'm ready to confront what logic refuses to name. Because even if I escape, I doubt I'll ever truly leave it behind. It has found me, and part of me fears it always will. I arrived home that night already on edge, though I couldn't say why. My chest felt tight, as if something weighed heavily on it. The air itself seemed charged. There was no wind, no sound of distant traffic, nothing but the drumming of my own pulse in my ears. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, heart pounding for reasons I did not yet understand. Almost immediately, I sensed that the house wasn't quite right. The living room was dark, darker than usual, like the shadows had deepened in my brief absence. My breathing quickened, and I felt that peculiar discomfort that comes from thinking you are not alone. That was when I turned toward the window and saw the mark. It was shaped like a human hand, pressed against the glass from inside, facing me. But the color was all wrong. A dull, sickly grayish tone that looked more like a stain of some foul substance than an ordinary fingerprint. Tentatively, I reached out and touched the glass. The chill that met my fingertips made me recoil as if I'd been burned. It was cold, almost clammy, reminiscent of damp earth or graveyard stones in the depths of winter. My heart fluttered, and I felt the sting of sweat bead along my temples. For a moment, I couldn't quite move. My legs felt rooted to the floor. The shape of the hand was deeply unsettling. The palm large, the fingers elongated in a subtle yet disturbing way. I could see faint ridges, as though the flesh itself had pressed into the glass with a grotesque level of detail. I glanced around the dimly lit room, half expecting to see someone crouched in the corner. But the living room was empty, the furniture as I had left it. My instincts screamed that I should check the locks, check the doors, ensure no intruder was inside. Yet I just stood there, paralyzed by that single impression on the glass. Eventually, I forced myself to breathe. My mind clung to the rational idea that perhaps someone had played a prank. I reached for a rag from the kitchen and returned to wipe the window clean. The mark smeared at first, leaving a blurred gray residue. Then it vanished under the cloth. I rubbed until no trace remained. My heartbeat finally started to slow, though my hand trembled around the rag. I decided to double-check all the locks in the house. I made sure every window was closed, every latch secure. By the time I crawled into bed, I'd convinced myself it was all some bizarre joke or an inexplicable smear of dirt. Still, I couldn't sleep without imagining that clammy presence pressed against my window. The next morning, I woke with a slight headache. A part of me was relieved when the sunlight poured through the curtains, making the living room seem more welcoming. But as I walked by that same window, I froze. The mark had returned, but it wasn't exactly the same as before. The new handprint was tilted at a different angle, almost as if it had shifted during the night. The fingers appeared a fraction longer, leaving the faintest suggestion of scratches near the tips. I peered closely at the glass, trying to confirm what I was seeing. Yes, there were tiny lines etched into the surface, so small they could have been cracks, or perhaps the glass had been scraped. Either way, it sent a shudder through my entire body. I tried cleaning it again with more force. This time, the impression faded only after I pressed so hard I worried I might crack the pane. Once it disappeared, I took a step back, my breath ragged, my skin clammy. I felt watched, as though something waited just beyond my peripheral vision. Several times I jerked my head around, expecting to see a figure or a shape hovering there. But there was nothing. An inexplicable paranoia wound itself into my thoughts, whispering that the hand was more than a simple mark. I felt foolish, even considering the possibility of something supernatural. Yet I couldn't deny the chill that lingered in the very air. That evening, I came home an hour earlier than usual, determined to catch anyone who might be sneaking around outside. I checked around the house, behind the bushes, along the fence, and even asked a neighbor indirectly if they had noticed anything strange. They mentioned they hadn't, but there was something in their tone that suggested they found my question peculiar. I couldn't blame them. I was practically vibrating with tension. My palms were damp, my heart stuttering in my chest. It was impossible to stop my mind from conjuring images of a pale figure pressing its hand to my window. Over and over, I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Night fell, and despite my precautions, despite checking that all the windows were locked, I still felt uneasy. Every shadow in the living room seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The overhead light flickered once or twice, intensifying my nerves. My mouth went dry as I tried to maintain some semblance of calm. I heard a muffled tapping noise, or something close to it, but when I got up to investigate, there was nothing. It was only when I forced myself to walk back to the sofa that I noticed the handprint had returned again, almost mocking me from the same spot. This time, the mark was darker, and the scratches at the fingertips were more pronounced, slicing delicate lines into the glass. My body shivered as a wave of sheer dread washed over me, crashing like cold water on my spine. I could barely breathe, and my heart was hammering so loud that I thought it might burst. I pressed my hand to my chest, reminding myself to take slow breaths. Yet my gaze remained locked on that elongated shape. The very outline of the palm felt hostile and invasive, as though it was claiming possession of my home. For reasons I couldn't explain, my skin crawled at the sight of it. This was no mere prank. Something wanted in. Something was testing the boundary between outside and in, leaving these unearthly traces as a warning or an invitation. I decided, then and there, to secure the house like a fortress. I installed additional locks on every window, even buying special reinforcement bars for sliding windows. I also invested in a thick, opaque cloth that I used to cover the living room window completely. The idea was to block out any possibility of seeing that ghastly imprint. If I couldn't see it, maybe it would lose its power over me. Yet deep down, I doubted such a simple fix would truly matter. The sense of intrusion, the sinister aura that accompanied those handprints, wouldn't vanish just because I blocked my view. Still, I followed through. That night, the living room fell into a claustrophobic darkness. The heavy cloth over the window turned the space oppressive. The only light I allowed was a dim lamp, which created more shadows than illumination. My breathing echoed in the silence, and every small noise, pipes creaking, floorboards settling, struck my nerves like a slap. My heart rate refused to settle. My mind conjured images of a hand pressing against the cloth from the outside, dragging its unnatural fingers across the fabric. I thought I heard faint scraping sounds, but whenever I paused to listen more carefully, the noise stopped. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake in bed, the sheets damp with sweat. My body refused to cool down, and my pulse pounded in my temples. I was caught between wanting to brave the living room and check the window or just bury myself deeper into the blankets. Ultimately, fear won. I stayed in bed until dawn, drifting in and out of an uneasy half-sleep. When morning finally arrived, I forced myself out of the house to go about my routine, hoping daylight might clear my head. Instead, I returned in the early afternoon to find subtle signs that the window cloth had been disturbed. It hung slightly crooked, and there was a faint tear along one edge. My pulse spiked immediately. I pulled the cloth aside, and sure enough, the glass behind it bore fresh scratches. The shape of the handprint was gone, but the glass had spiderwebbed with lines from where something, or someone, had clawed at it. I felt an almost electric jolt of horror pulse through my limbs. My mouth went dry, and I tasted panic on the back of my tongue. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but my mind refused to comply. That sense of being watched returned tenfold, making the hair on my arms stand on end. Each breath felt like shards of ice entering my lungs. I kept glancing at the corners of the room, certain I would catch a glimpse of movement, a flicker of some shape I couldn't name. My paranoia ballooned until I was almost lightheaded. Desperate for some sense of control, I decided to document everything meticulously. I took pictures of the scratches, though they were faint and difficult to capture. I even recorded audio in my living room overnight, hoping to pick up any strange sounds. But when I played it back, all I heard was a faint static that rose and fell in irregular intervals, like heavy, distorted breathing. That alone was enough to make my skin prickle with goosebumps. In an attempt to regain my sanity, I rearranged the furniture to create a clear view of the window from anywhere in the living room. I also filled the house with as much light as I could during the day, opening curtains everywhere else to push back the gloom that seemed to cling to me. Yet none of that helped. Each time I heard a noise, my heart lurched in my chest, my throat constricted, and sweat traced a cold path down my back. The nights were the worst. Every creak turned into a footstep in my imagination. Every rustle of the wind outside became a sinister presence testing the walls. My reflection in the hallway mirror startled me so badly once that I nearly screamed. The lines between what was real and what was merely the product of my frayed nerves were blurring. I began to question my own perception, wondering if I was losing my grip. Perhaps I was conjuring this entire nightmare from some deep well of anxiety. But then I would remember the clammy texture of that first handprint, the way my own fingertips had recoiled from the glass. One evening, I was so filled with restless energy that I paced in circles around the living room. I caught sight of the cloth over the window trembling. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning kicking in, so I turned off the unit. Still, the cloth shook, gently but persistently, as if someone's fingertips were brushing the outside surface of the window. My stomach twisted into knots. I felt a wave of nausea as adrenaline coursed through me, tightening every muscle in my body. I approached the window slowly. My hands were clammy, shaking so badly that I had to force them into fists just to maintain some semblance of control. When I finally stood inches from the cloth, I could almost sense movement behind the glass. My scalp tingled, and I could feel the blood rushing through my veins. Time seemed to slow, and I felt the thunderous pound of my heart echo in my head. Without warning, a sharp crack split the silence, and the entire window frame vibrated like a massive chord of some horrifying instrument had been struck. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. That presence on the other side was testing the barrier again, more forceful this time, leaving me with the undeniable impression that it had grown bolder. My response was to reinforce the window further, layering it with duct tape, wood planks, and anything else that could hamper entry. The living room now felt like a sealed tomb. Each day, the gloom in that room seemed thicker, as though it were a living thing feeding on my terror. My thoughts became more frantic. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked gaunt, my eyes sunken. I couldn't concentrate at work or during any conversation. My mind always drifted back to that window, that presence, that unearthly hand. Eventually, I reached a point where I refused to stay in the living room after dark. I set up a makeshift sleeping arrangement in the bedroom, triple locking the door behind me. But I could still hear noises, faint yet insistent, tapping, scraping, crackling. At times it sounded like breathing, raspy and desperate. My heart would race until my vision blurred. I often found myself on the brink of hyperventilating, struggling to breathe normally as the minutes dragged through the night. One night, just as I felt exhaustion lull me to a fitful sleep, a thunderous bang on the living room window jolted me upright. My lungs seized as if I had plunged into icy water. I knew I had to face this thing. Staying in bed, cowering, was not going to end it. Summoning every last ounce of courage, I walked out into the hallway, each step heavy with dread. When I reached the living room, a series of sharp cracks resonated, as though something was hammering on the glass with an unnatural strength. My skin crawled with the raw, electric surge of terror. I stared at the barricaded window and realized the cloth had been torn away in places, revealing glimmers of the battered glass beneath. The shape of the handprint was there, more twisted than ever before. The fingers were unnaturally elongated, each tip ending in a deep scratch etched into the pane. My vision seemed to blur. For an instant, I thought I saw movement behind the hand, a slight shift, a shadow crossing the thin veil of darkness. My gut twisted, and I realized that, in some impossible way, the boundary of the window was no longer certain. There was a sense that the space beyond the glass did not align with my familiar backyard or the outside world I knew. It felt like a void, a different plane, from which this presence strained to emerge. My mind raced, and I asked myself if I was going mad. Was this truly happening? Or had I created a nightmare so elaborate that I could no longer distinguish it from reality? My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my entire body quivered with fear. Yet I took a step closer to the window, feeling a sick compulsion to confront it. The cracks in the glass pulsed under the dim light, as if they were veins. The handprint was now more like a claw, each finger distended and menacing. I was breathing so loudly that it drowned out every other sound except the rhythmic pounding of my heart. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed a heavy curtain rod and slammed it against the glass. I half expected to see the window shatter. Instead, there was a hollow noise, and the reflection of the hand swirled, almost like a ripple in dark water, before fading into a smear of gray. In that moment, a sharp, aching pressure spread behind my eyes, and I nearly doubled over from the dizziness. It felt as if I were standing on the edge of a chasm, gazing into a realm that defied reason. Then, in a blink, everything went silent. I couldn't breathe for several seconds, waiting for the next sign of movement, the next crack. But none came. My body was trembling so violently that I had to lean against the wall. The adrenaline coursing through my veins left me lightheaded, but also weirdly resolute. I realized this thing, whatever it was, didn't hold all the power. I had found a way to disrupt it, if only for a moment. My mind buzzed with 1,000 questions, but none of them had immediate answers. Now, a few days later, I haven't seen the handprint reappear. The cloth remains torn, the glass still shows faint scratches, but the presence behind it is quiet, for the time being. Despite the reprieve, I can't shake the sense that it's merely watching, waiting for the opportune moment. I can't sleep without hearing echoes of that raspy scratching in my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I catch the faintest hint of movement just beyond the corner of my vision, as if a hand is slowly pulling back from the glass. My heart lurches with every flicker of shadow. I suspect it isn't gone, only biding its time. The air in the living room remains thick with tension, and I keep my distance from the window. Even my own reflection in the glass, faint and distorted, sets my nerves on edge. I don't know if I'll ever truly feel safe here again. Every so often, I feel a gust of cold air sweep through the house, even though all the windows and doors are closed. My rational mind can't comprehend it, but my instincts know that something lurks just on the other side of that fragile barrier. Perhaps it's waiting for a sign of weakness, or perhaps it's content to let me torment myself in the meantime. All I know is that each night, as I lie awake in the stifling silence, I can sense it. In my mind's eye, I see the shape of that awful hand, those elongated fingers splayed against the glass, pressing forward, testing the divide between two worlds, and I can't be sure that it won't finally succeed in crossing over. That single thought, that dreadful uncertainty, is the only thing that truly haunts me. The possibility that one day, the next time I come home, I won't just find a handprint. I'll find the window open, and something waiting for me on the other side. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into that building. The air felt different in the hallways at night. Heavy, almost oily, as if it clung to my skin and got inside my lungs. The overhead lights in the corridors flickered unpredictably, casting odd shadows on the walls that made me feel watched. Even during the day, the place seemed dimmer than it should have been. But it was at night, when I ventured into the communal laundry room in the basement, that the real dread set in. I could never quite place why my heart pounded so violently each time I pressed the button for the elevator and watched those dented metal doors slide open. I only knew that as soon as I arrived on the basement level, my entire body tensed, as if anticipating something lurking in the corners. My building is old, probably built decades ago, with stale brick corridors and concrete floors that have absorbed the footsteps of countless tenants. The laundry room itself is cramped, illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent light that buzzes like an insect about to die. At that late hour, the machines whir in a half-hearted, ghostly hum, and the smell of soap mixed with damp cement forms a nauseating cloud. Yet, I found it was often the only time I could do my washing without waiting in a line of neighbors. That's how I first noticed him. The man from the second floor, always there whenever I dared to go down late in the evening. He was tall and lanky, with a demeanor that made my pulse quicken. His eyes were perpetually wide, as though he was in a state of constant shock. Each time I entered the laundry room, I would see him standing by the washing machines, slowly transferring clothes from one basket to another. He rarely blinked. He just stared straight ahead, sometimes pivoting his gaze toward me for an uncomfortably long moment. Whenever I caught him looking, I felt my shoulders tense and a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. On the first few occasions, I tried to convince myself it was only my imagination. Perhaps the poor lighting and the man's natural disposition made him seem more unnerving than he truly was. I ignored the hair-raising sensation that tore through me whenever I glimpsed his wide-eyed stare. I told myself I was being paranoid, simply allowing my nerves to get the best of me in a dark, unsettling basement. But each subsequent trip to the laundry room proved that this was more than just a trick of the light. One evening, after a particularly long day, I gathered my laundry at around 10 o'clock and headed downstairs. My legs were heavy, but I needed clean shirts for the following morning. The elevator descended with its usual screech, and when the doors parted, the corridor seemed even more poorly lit than usual. The fluorescent bulbs overhead buzzed in and out of life, leaving pools of shadow where the corners should have been. My breath became shallow as I crept along the hallway. I half hoped he wouldn't be there, but I knew he would be. True to form, he was standing by a dryer, apparently waiting for his clothes to finish. As I walked in, I felt his eyes lock onto me in a jolting instant. A surge of adrenaline made my hands tremble, and I fumbled with my laundry basket, nearly dropping it on the floor. I willed myself to keep moving, to pretend nothing was amiss. I slid my clothes into a vacant machine, poured in detergent, and set the cycle. The entire time, I felt his stare scraping across my back. He eventually began hanging his damp clothes on a nearby drying rack. I kept my head down, focusing on the small squares of cracked tile beneath my feet. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed droplets falling from his shirts. I assumed it was just water at first, but something about the color and viscosity snagged my attention. It was dark, far too dark. My pulse throbbed in my neck, and sweat formed in a cold sheen along my temples. I tried to summon the courage to glance more directly. My gaze flickered to the concrete floor, where I saw droplets of a deep, almost black liquid, splattering in slow, deliberate falls from the fabric. My stomach twisted into a knot, and my throat went dry. Every part of my body urged me to leave, but I froze in place, haunted by a mix of curiosity and terror. Then I heard him speak in a low, urgent tone. He asked if I had noticed the shadows behind him. My heart gave a single violent pound against my rib cage. I forced myself to reply that I hadn't seen anything. My voice came out in a dry rasp, barely more than a whisper. He didn't say another word, but he turned ever so slightly, and I saw his eyes roll toward the dark corners of the ceiling. His face was drawn and pale, and though I couldn't be certain, I felt certain that he believed something was back there, stalking him, or maybe even clinging to him. The entire room seemed to shrink, as if the walls were pressing in. The overhead light flickered again, casting elongated shadows that crept along the floor. Even though I didn't see anything tangible lurking in that corner, I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. I quickly gathered the last of my damp clothes from the washing machine, decided to forego drying them, and made a hasty retreat. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't get a full breath. I hurried down the hallway, the corridor's stale air closing in around me. The overhead lights seemed to dim with each step, and by the time I reached the elevator, my shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. Pressing the up button felt like an eternity. In that endless moment, I heard a faint rasp behind me, a sound I couldn't quite identify. Could it have been the squeak of a sneaker on concrete or something else entirely? When the elevator doors finally opened, I sprinted inside, but as I turned to press the button for my floor, I saw him again at the end of the hallway. He stood there, his head tilted backward, as if something above was tugging his chin up toward the ceiling. I felt a cold wave of dread ripple through my stomach. The elevator doors slid shut and blocked him from sight, but my heart wouldn't stop hammering for what felt like minutes afterward. I stumbled back to my apartment, locked the door, and tried to convince myself that I was safe. For a while, I avoided doing laundry at night. I changed my schedule, forcing myself to find a free washing machine during daylight hours, even if it meant waiting in line or juggling my job commitments. At first, that seemed to solve the issue. I didn't see him as often, and I had fewer reasons to descend into that basement corridor. But even during the day, I felt an undercurrent of foreboding. Each time I walked past him in the hallway, or even when I just passed his door, I felt a subtle shift in the air. My spine tingled with an unshakable sense of being watched. Sometimes, even though I saw him standing perfectly still, I sensed that something else was near him, sharing his space in a way that shouldn't have been possible. My nights became restless. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, gasping for air. I dreamt of that laundry room, the flickering light, and the dark liquid dripping from shirts. In my nightmares, the corridors were endless, each turn revealing him at a different angle, his head always tilted toward the ceiling, eyes bulging in silent hysteria. Occasionally, in those twisted dreams, I would feel a cold hand on my shoulder, and I'd wake up with a shout caught in my throat. My sanity began to fray around the edges. I found myself double-checking door locks, peering through the peephole whenever I heard the slightest noise in the hallway. One afternoon, I overheard a neighbor mention the second-floor man's behavior. She seemed uneasy, mentioning in hushed tones that he had been standing at the building's entrance late at night, staring upward as if waiting for someone, or something, that never arrived. She said he looked skittish, as though he was anticipating an attack from above. I tried to feign indifference, but my heart rate skyrocketed. I realized I wasn't alone in noticing something was off about him, yet that small comfort didn't alleviate the growing anxiety that gnawed at my mind. As the days passed, I found myself needing to do laundry again at an inconvenient time. My workload had become overwhelming, and I had no choice but to go down to the laundry room shortly after midnight. My reluctance was intense. My hands were already clammy before I even grabbed the basket. I tried to remind myself that I was an adult, that buildings can be creepy and neighbors can be strange. But as soon as I stepped onto the elevator, a surge of claustrophobia swept through me. The walls felt too close, the lights too dim, and the ride too long. When the doors opened to the basement, the corridor greeted me with a cold draft that raised goosebumps on my arms. Every footstep echoed strangely against the concrete, as if there were more than just my steps bouncing back. I approached the laundry room slowly, half expecting to see him behind the door, but the space was empty. The machines hummed softly, and I managed to load my laundry without interruption. My heartbeat began to settle, but I couldn't shake the uncanny sensation that I was being watched from behind the rows of washers and dryers. I kept stealing glances over my shoulder, but the place was deserted. I decided to wait there rather than leave my clothes unattended. Leaning against the vibrating washing machine, I tried to occupy my mind by scrolling through my phone. Minutes ticked by in an agonizing crawl. Then, in the corner of my vision, I noticed a faint flicker of movement near the ceiling. My throat constricted, and I lifted my gaze. I saw a shifting darkness near the overhead light fixture, a swirl of shadow that shouldn't have been there. A sudden wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, and my skin prickled with fear. I told myself it was just a trick of my tired eyes. But the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that something was hanging there, half blended with the gloom. A clang from outside the laundry room shattered the silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart thudded so loudly I could feel it in my fingertips. Through the small wired glass panel in the laundry room door, I spotted a faint shape moving in the hallway. I held my breath. After a few seconds, the shape grew more distinct, resolving into the silhouette of the second-floor man. He was pacing, his footsteps echoing in a frantic rhythm, though his head still hung at an odd angle. His arms twitched every so often, as if trying to ward off invisible attackers. I couldn't bring myself to step into the hallway with him there. My body was in a state of paralysis, torn between the urge to flee and the horrifying desire to see what he would do. My pulse hammered, and sweat trickled down the side of my face. Then, as if sensing my stare, he stopped in front of the door. Through the wire mesh glass, his gaze locked with mine. A jolt of raw terror shot through my nerves. I could feel every hair on my body standing up as if charged with static electricity. He reached for the doorknob. My mouth went bone dry, and my breathing grew shallow. In my mind, I begged for the machine cycle to finish so I could grab my clothes and race upstairs. But time felt stuck. The fluorescent bulb overhead buzzed louder, pulsing in an irregular staccato. The man slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. He stood there, hunched forward, eyes bloodshot and unblinking. If he said anything, I couldn't hear it over the pounding in my ears. However, his lips moved as if muttering something under his breath, words that refused to form in the air. He took a step inside, and in that moment, the overhead light flickered off for just a heartbeat. When it buzzed back on, I saw him jerk his head upward. It reminded me of a puppet whose strings had been pulled too hard from above. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and I heard a strained wheeze from his throat. I felt a surge of panic so potent that my body went cold. My instincts screamed at me to leave my laundry and run, just like I had done before. Without hesitation, I lunged for the exit. As I brushed past him, I caught a whiff of something damp and metallic. Like old iron, my entire body convulsed in revulsion. In the corridor, I stumbled forward, my legs half numb. The hallway's flickering lights distorted my surroundings into a chaotic mosaic of shifting shapes. Behind me, I heard the man shuffle, accompanied by a faint scraping sound that I couldn't identify. It was as if his shoes were dragging something over the concrete, or perhaps something was dragging him. My breath came in ragged bursts, and my heart threatened to burst from my chest. At that point, my only thought was to put as much distance as possible between me and the basement. When the elevator took too long, I spotted the stairwell door and sprinted through it, ignoring the echo of my own footsteps clanging on the metal steps. My lungs burned with every breath, and my hands were slick with sweat against the railing. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged onto my floor and practically vaulted into the hallway, fumbling with my keys. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door, latched the chain, and slid the deadbolt into place. I pressed my back against the wood, trying to steady my breathing. That was the last night I went anywhere near the laundry room after dark. In the days that followed, I avoided the second-floor man at all costs, darting down different corridors whenever I heard his familiar shuffling footsteps. My mind kept replaying the image of him with his neck craned back, as though pulled by an invisible wire. I struggled to sleep, my dreams plagued by half-formed figures trailing him in the shadows, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My sense of security dissolved, replaced by a ceaseless anxiety that gnawed at my nerves. Eventually, I decided I couldn't endure this silent dread any longer. I confronted my building's manager in broad daylight, quietly explaining that something was unsettling about the basement after dark. The manager listened, eyebrows raising in mild surprise, then offered vague reassurances about old buildings and flickering lights. I left the conversation unsatisfied, feeling none of the relief I had hoped for. If anything, speaking about it out loud just made my fear more real. Even now, I haven't witnessed anything that confirms a true supernatural force, but I can't deny the lingering sense that something is fundamentally wrong in that building. I still sense a presence in the corridors when the lights flicker, and I've overheard others mention unexplainable noises echoing up the stairwell at odd hours. Sometimes, when I exit my apartment, the air feels colder on my neck, as if an icy breath is brushing against me from behind. My heart still races whenever I think of stepping into that claustrophobic laundry room, where the walls seem to breathe in sync with the old machines. I've considered moving out, but for now I remain, trapped in a cycle of dread and wary curiosity. I do my laundry in the afternoon, in the presence of sunlight or at least other neighbors. If I so much as pass the basement door in the evening, a chill snakes across my back and makes my stomach lurch. I avoid meeting the second-floor man's gaze in the hallway, though I sometimes catch sight of him from the corner of my eye. He still seems haunted, glancing upward as if waiting for the ceiling to cave in, or for something to descend upon him. Late at night, alone in my bed, I recall the dark drops that fell from his shirts and the question he once posed. Had I seen the shadows behind him? I always answered no, both to him and to myself. But deep down, I wonder if the reason I kept seeing him in that laundry room was because those shadows were not just behind him. They were behind me as well. And although I escaped that basement corridor with my sanity barely intact, the memory of those flickering lights and that slow, steady drip of something far darker than water has left a permanent mark on my mind. Even in the safety of daylight, the faint hum of washing machines echoes in my thoughts, a chilling reminder that sometimes the things we don't see are the ones that follow us home. The stale odor of the room seemed to thicken the instant I stepped inside, as though the walls themselves exhaled a faint, musty breath the moment I flicked the light switch. A tinge of electricity danced on my tongue, an almost metallic taste of dread. Even before I glanced at the closet in the corner, I felt something was off about this place. The air felt dense, as if I'd plunged underwater. My pulse quickened, and a light sheen of sweat formed on the back of my neck. That closet door, always slightly ajar, yet somehow never opening more than a hand's width, loomed like a silent sentinel. In the hush of the late evening, that narrow gap seemed to watch me more than I observed it. And with each passing second, I became increasingly aware of a presence on the other side. Something hidden, waiting. I moved into this apartment a few months ago, thinking it a great find for the price. The landlord seemed relieved to hand over the keys, though he never said so outright. He simply mentioned that the previous tenant had left in a hurry, citing a career opportunity in another state. I remember feeling a pang of unease, wondering why someone would break their lease so suddenly, yet the rent was low, and the place itself, albeit old, looked sturdy enough at a glance. The moment I settled in, however, I began to notice tiny details that gnawed at me. The hallway floorboards seemed to creak in patterns late at night, as if someone paced back and forth when I was trying to sleep. There was a slight tapping behind the walls too, a noise that I initially dismissed as old pipes or maybe stray rodents. But the strangest detail centered on the built-in closet in my bedroom. Every apartment I'd lived in before had standard closets with doors that swung open freely. But here, the closet door was wedged somehow, refusing to open more than a few inches. No matter how much I pulled or prodded, it felt as if an invisible force was preventing it from moving any farther. One evening, I even tried using a crowbar, but the wood gave only slightly, allowing me to widen the gap by maybe another inch or two. That was when I first heard the whispering. I thought it might be a draft carrying voices from another unit, but it didn't quite sound like that. It was too faint, too breathy, almost like someone exhaling through clenched teeth. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I wrote it off as my imagination. Over the next few nights, the whispering grew more frequent, always originating from that exact spot. My nights turned restless. I would wake up multiple times, heart pounding, convinced I had heard a raspy murmur in my ear. Whenever I sat up, my eyes would dart to the closet door, still partially open. On 2 occasions, I could have sworn the opening was wider than before, by mere millimeters perhaps, but enough to unsettle me. Occasionally I found myself creeping out of bed, edging closer to that door with my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. I would peer into the darkness, only to see dusty shelves or the faint outline of old hangers. Yet I sensed something beyond that, some deeper space that shouldn't exist in such a simple built-in closet. After a week of fragmented sleep and mounting paranoia, I decided to force the door open fully, once and for all. It was late afternoon on a Saturday. I felt more confident with the daylight streaming through the windows, as though any lurking shadows would be banished by the sun's presence. I fetched my toolbox, braced my shoulder against the closet door, and leveraged every bit of strength I had. The door creaked horribly, the wood protesting with a series of snapping sounds. My heart drummed in my ears and sweat slicked my forehead. Then with a final groan, the door gave way and swung open, revealing a dark recess that defied logic. I stood there in stunned silence, my breath hitching. This was no ordinary closet interior. It extended farther than the apartment's floor plan could possibly allow. The space yawned before me like the entrance to a cave. Dim light from the bedroom fell upon rough, uneven walls etched with bizarre symbols. Circles intersecting lines, crude figures locked in repeating patterns. A scent of damp wood, rotting from within, filled my nostrils. I took a cautious step inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and scanned the place with a flashlight. The beam caught lengths of rusty chain hanging from hooks in the ceiling, each link rattling softly as though disturbed by a slight breeze. Immediately, my pulse thundered in my chest. My throat went dry and my hands began to tremble. The jagged scrawls on the walls glinted with some sticky residue. I imagined it was paint, but the color seemed too dark, too brownish. I told myself it was simply old varnish or some bizarre attempt at decoration by a previous tenant. Yet a quiet, insistent voice in my head suggested otherwise. My flashlight quivered over the floor, revealing scratches gouged into the wood, as though furniture or something heavier had been dragged across it time and again. The chains swayed, their metal links scraping together in an unsettling rhythm that caused my stomach to clench. I noticed that at the far end of this hidden space, the darkness appeared to flicker. Something moved there, a shape so vague and contorted I almost doubted I'd really seen it. My heart pounded, and my breath became shallow. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it must be a trick of the light. The more I focused, the more I thought I could see an outline, crooked and hunched, pressing against the corner. My entire body tensed, preparing for some horrifying reveal. My legs felt like they wanted to bolt, but a macabre fascination held me rooted in place. I tried calling out, "Is anyone there?" The words left my throat in a shaky whisper so soft I barely recognized my own voice. Silence. The air in that hidden chamber seemed to compress, as though it were squeezing me. My temples throbbed, and cold beads of sweat trickled down the back of my neck. Then the shape twitched. It moved with an agonizing slowness that defied human motion, jerking in small increments as if adjusting to the light. And in that moment, I heard it, an unmistakable whisper, a low hiss that felt like it was brushing right against my ear, even though I stood several feet away. I staggered back, nearly losing my balance. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I forced myself to remain there long enough to shine the flashlight once more. The silhouette was gone, vanished into the corner's gloom as if it had dissolved into the walls. I realized my hands were shaking so violently that the flashlight beam jounced erratically across the chains, intensifying my sense of disorientation. My breath came in ragged gasps, chest tight with a primal fear. The moment seemed endless, a stretch of time where I felt pinned under the weight of something I couldn't name. My thoughts spiraled, questioning if I was hallucinating or if a presence truly occupied that hidden alcove. The smell of rot and dank wood became overwhelming. I gagged, pressing a hand to my mouth. My instincts finally took over, and I stumbled backward, practically throwing myself out of the closet and back into the bedroom. My heart hammered so loudly that for a moment I heard nothing else. Once I realized I stood safely outside that dark threshold, I slammed the closet door shut with a trembling hand. I shoved my dresser against it, my limbs quivering from the surge of adrenaline. I remember bracing myself against the wall, chest heaving, sweat trickling down my temples. My eyes stung from wide-eyed terror, and every muscle in my body felt poised for a desperate flight. That evening, I tried to convince myself it had all been some bizarre optical illusion. Perhaps I'd stared too long into the shadows, conjuring shapes out of the gloom. But I couldn't dismiss the whispering, that soft hiss echoing in my mind long after I left the room. Each time I blinked, I saw the flicker of that contorted outline. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt, and my eyes were bloodshot from lack of rest. I hardly recognized myself as I splashed cold water on my face. The handle of the bathroom faucet rattled in my grip, and I realized I was trembling from head to toe. My skin felt clammy, and the hair on my arms stood on end. That night I barely slept. Every slight noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of traffic, the creak of old wood, set me on edge. I kept imagining footsteps near the closet door, or the faint clink of chains shifting behind the walls. My heart pounded so furiously that I heard my own pulse throbbing in my ears. Eventually, I drifted into a restless doze. Dreams plagued me. Images of narrow hallways scrawled with incomprehensible symbols, and a presence breathing hotly against my neck. I woke multiple times, gasping for air, certain I'd heard that whisper again. Morning brought no relief. I considered calling a friend or even the landlord to discuss what I'd found, but the notion felt absurd. How could I explain that I'd discovered a hidden extension of my closet filled with chains and sinister markings? Worse yet, how would I describe that flickering, contorted shape? I imagined someone on the other end of the conversation remarking that I sounded disturbed or paranoid, so I said nothing, choosing instead to go about my routine in a haze of dread. Even in broad daylight, I sensed that the closet door was quietly mocking me from the bedroom, reminding me of what lurked beyond. I began leaving the apartment for as long as possible, returning only late at night when exhaustion dulled my terror. The few colleagues I interacted with at work noticed my jumpiness, and I overheard some muttering that I looked ill or stressed. Sleep deprivation gnawed at my sanity, and a small part of me wondered if I should seek professional help. Still, a stubborn piece of me felt that I had to confront this on my own. If something truly dwelled in that hidden chamber, I needed to know what it was, or at least confirm I wasn't losing my grip on reality. As the days passed, little things in the apartment grew increasingly disturbing. Objects on my bedside table would shift positions overnight, though I couldn't recall touching them. Once, The lamp had toppled over, its bulb shattered. Another time, I discovered thin scratches on my wooden floor near the closet, as if something had attempted to drag itself out while I slept. My nights were punctuated by fleeting sounds of chain links, jingling, and hushed murmurings just beyond my bedroom walls. A creeping paranoia settled over me. I started checking my own reflection repeatedly, half expecting to see that shape looming behind me. Finally, in a moment of grim resolve, I decided to wedge the closet door completely shut and seal it off for good. I bought heavy-duty nails and hammered them across the frame, then shoved my heaviest furniture up against it. Each strike of the hammer drove my heart rate higher, my mind racing with the possibility that something on the other side might be listening. By the time I finished, my clothes were soaked in sweat, and my shoulders ached. I hoped that would be enough to contain whatever was back there, or at least keep me from ever venturing inside again. That night, I lay in bed, a hammer still in my hand, just in case. The air in my bedroom felt oppressive, thick with the stench of dread. My heart pounded so hard I felt my mattress vibrate with each beat. Yet nothing happened. The hours ticked by, and the room remained silent. I drifted into a tense sleep, the hammer clutched against my chest. For the first time in weeks, my rest was almost uninterrupted, though I awoke with a stabbing pain in my right hand from gripping the tool so tightly. In the days that followed, I told myself it was over. I tried to re-establish a normal routine, going to work, coming home, making dinner, and avoiding even the sight of that barricaded door. Gradually, the apartment felt less threatening, as though whatever was inside the closet had lost interest in me, or found itself trapped behind my improvised seal. I no longer heard the rustling of chains or that harrowing whisper at night. Though I still felt uneasy, I managed a few nights of decent sleep. But the calmness did not last. Roughly a week after I'd sealed the door, I woke up in the dead of night, instantly alert. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my skin prickled with a sudden chill. My heart hammered in my throat, and I realized why. The room was filled with the faint but unmistakable scent of rotten wood, a scent I had come to loathe. My mind raced. Had something seeped through the cracks? I listened, sweat pooling at my temples. A soft scrape on the other side of the wall made my stomach flip. It sounded like nails on wood, an almost tentative scratching that seemed to travel along the length of the closet. My breath caught in my throat. It felt as though someone, or something, was running its fingers along the exact spot I'd nailed shut. I froze, paralyzed by the possibility that my feeble barrier wasn't enough. My mouth went bone dry, and my muscles tensed so hard they threatened to spasm. I heard a faint click, followed by a slow, dragging noise. It took me a moment to realize that the chain sound was back, heavier and more deliberate this time. A surge of dread coursed through me. The closet door wasn't just an inanimate frame anymore. It felt alive, pulsing with an energy that threatened to break free. I leaped out of bed, heart pounding in my ears. Something inside urged me to fling open the front door and run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was shaking from head to toe, pinned by the dread that the slightest noise from me would provoke whatever lurked behind that wall. The scratching continued, methodically working its way up the wood, pausing, then continuing again. The reek of damp decay clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. Yet still, I stayed rooted to the spot, eyes locked on that corner of the room. By the time morning light crept through the thin curtains, the scratching had subsided. My body felt drained, as though I'd been in a battle for hours. I realized I couldn't endure another night like that. Gathering what little courage I had left, I made a plan to leave this apartment for good. I stuffed my essentials into 2 suitcases and decided to move out without explanation. I didn't care about losing my security deposit or the inconvenience of finding a new place. I only knew I couldn't spend another minute haunted by that doorway. Before leaving, I approached the closet one last time, my pulse thrumming with dread. The barricade was still in place, though the nails looked warped, as if they'd been pushed from the other side. The door had splintered in several spots, hairline cracks radiating through the wood. A sour wave of nausea rolled through me. Whatever was inside had tried to get out, almost succeeding. Without second guessing, I grabbed a permanent marker and wrote a single warning on the wall above the closet frame. "Do not open." My hand shook so badly that the letters were barely legible. Then I fled, slamming the front door behind me. I drove away with my stomach knotted, a cold sweat clinging to my skin. Hours later, as I checked into a hotel room miles away, I couldn't shake the sense that I was still being watched. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked hollow. My eyes darted to any dark corner, half expecting to see a silhouette crouching there. Even now, I can't explain what I saw in that cramped, impossible space. All I know is that my hands still tremble when I think about that contorted figure and the rasp of those chains. The memory clings to me, a persistent fear that I locked something truly malevolent back in that closet, yet maybe not fully contained. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I jolt awake, heart racing, convinced I hear whispers echoing in my new home. I can't be sure whether they're real or just the ghosts of my own terror. What I do know is that I'll never open a closet door again without a jolt of panic, and I'll always wonder if I left something behind, still prowling those hidden shadows, waiting for someone else to discover its secrets. The thought sends a fresh surge of fear through my veins, and I realize my nightmares may never truly end. That silent, contorted presence has embedded itself in my mind, and I suspect it might remain there, whispering from the dark corners of my memory for the rest of my life. I felt something shift in the air the moment I stepped into the attic, as though the dust motes floating in the dim light had suddenly become watchers. The space smelled of old timber and damp insulation, and yet there was an underlying acidity that made me almost taste rust on my tongue. My heart thudded, not from the exertion of climbing the creaky ladder, but from an unshakable sense that I was intruding on a place that preferred to remain undisturbed. The narrow beam of my flashlight revealed cobweb-shrouded beams and stacks of boxes in various stages of decay. I remember thinking, in that instant, that the darkness wasn't simply an absence of light. It felt alive, almost as if the shadows themselves were breathing. That was how my ordeal began, an ominous greeting from the gloom of an attic that had secrets to hide. I had been renovating my recently purchased house for a few weeks, focusing on practical tasks first, repairing the roof, checking for leaks, reinforcing old beams. Eventually, the attic needed attention. I'd expected a messy but uneventful job, cleaning out junk, patching holes, making sure there wasn't any structural damage. I never imagined I would discover a small wooden chest tucked behind a false wall. The chest was locked, but age had weakened its hinges. With a firm twist of a screwdriver, it surrendered with a crack. Inside were dusty documents, yellowed pages bound by brittle ribbons, and a single folded letter placed on top. It was addressed to any future resident, which instantly piqued my curiosity. The letter was short, the handwriting shaky and uneven, as though the person who wrote it had been barely able to keep the pen steady. It warned, "Do not open the passage to what lives between the walls. Once freed, it grows stronger. It feeds on your breath, your thoughts, your fear." My pulse quickened, and goosebumps spread along my arms. At first, I assumed it was some old superstition or local lore, maybe the product of a lonely imagination. Yet the message was undeniably unsettling. It evoked an urgent tone, practically vibrating off the page. It was the kind of note that should make anyone think twice about rummaging further. After reading through the older documents, mostly receipts from decades ago and letters describing ordinary household concerns, I discovered a diagram. It depicted the attic from a vantage point I recognized, but there was a new detail. A small square drawn in the far corner, labeled Concealed Hatch. I followed the diagram, flashlight beam dancing across the wooden boards. There, under a large stack of dusty boxes, I found the trapdoor. I felt an irrational thrill, or perhaps a grim curiosity, as I shifted the boxes aside. The trapdoor was built flush with the floor, its edges outlined with an ornate pattern carved into the wood. There was a cast iron ring for a handle, locked in place by an old-fashioned latch. The space around it smelled of stale air, and I caught a hint of something chemical. Without thinking, I used a small crowbar to pry open the latch. The moment the latch clicked free, a gust of cold wind erupted from the hatch. It was so sudden and forceful that it knocked over the nearby boxes, scattering papers and old cloths everywhere. I staggered backward. My flashlight flickered, and in the swirl of dust, I heard something. An echo that could have been laughter, but it was muffled as though it was coming through layers of thick insulation. The sound was more a vibration in my chest than a noise in my ears. Terror shot through me like electricity. My hands shook as I forced the trapdoor shut, pressing my weight on it until the strange wind died down. In the silence that followed, I could hear my heart pounding in my temples. The chill I felt wasn't just from the air. It was deep and penetrating, like stepping into icy water. From that night onward, nothing felt the same. At first, it was only at bedtime. I would sink into my mattress and feel a faint draft grazing my neck, accompanied by a distant whisper that might have been my own imagination. But my nights quickly evolved into a cycle of fitful sleep and jarring awakenings. In the mornings, I would find myself drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me. My dreams, though impossible to recall in detail, always involved the attic and the sense that someone, or something, was trying to coax me back there. I'd feel my name being spoken softly, entangled with the swirl of cold air I had felt when I opened that hatch. Even recalling these nocturnal episodes now makes the hair on my arms stand on end. I began to lose track of time. Ordinary tasks at work felt distant and unimportant. Colleagues asked if I was ill, noting my pale complexion and hollow eyes. I would respond by vaguely mentioning stress from renovations, but inside I knew the real source. Something had changed in my house, and it had to do with that hidden passage. My anxiety peaked whenever I heard an unusual sound within the walls, like a faint scratching or a low hum. The rational part of my mind insisted these noises were just old pipes or small animals, but I couldn't ignore the memory of that letter and the malicious rush of air. Each time I tried to dismiss the supernatural explanation, the recollection of that fleeting laughter drowned out my skepticism. I called a contractor to check the attic structure. He reassured me the beams were stable, but I noticed he was uneasy up there, complaining about a sudden chill and an odd draft that made his hair stand on end. He didn't say much else, only advising me to keep the attic well ventilated to prevent mold. After he left, I felt both relieved and anxious. Relieved that I wasn't the only one to perceive the strange cold. Anxious because it confirmed something unnatural was happening. With each passing day, the house felt less and less like a shelter. The walls seemed to pulse with some hidden heartbeat, and I could have sworn the shadows in the corners were darker than before. A few evenings later, I was sitting in my living room attempting to distract myself with a book. A sudden gust rattled the front windows. I felt compelled to look upstairs, my eyes drawn to the attic door. My breath caught in my throat, and a prickling sensation spread across the back of my neck. The draft in the room felt targeted, not random. It was as if the air itself wanted to push me toward the attic. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up. My footsteps on the stairs sounded unnaturally loud, and each step caused a dull vibration that reverberated through the house's wooden frame. My mouth was dry, and the closer I got to the attic, the more pronounced the dryness became, as if every bit of moisture was being leached from my body by the very air around me. When I opened the attic door, my heart pounded so hard that I could feel it in my gums. Darkness swallowed the narrow space except for the stark circle of light from my flashlight. All the boxes I had reorganized were right where I'd left them, and the trapdoor in the corner remained shut. But I sensed a presence, something intangible pressing against my awareness. I heard a faint rasping that might have been the wind, or might have been breathing. Moving closer to the trapdoor, I found myself trembling. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a sudden wave of nausea, as though my stomach were flipping upside down. Then I heard it. An echo of my name, impossibly gentle, floating from nowhere and everywhere at once. I didn't dare open the trapdoor again. I backed away, my skin clammy and goosebumps erupting over my arms. Every nerve in my body screamed to leave. I nearly tripped on the top step in my haste to exit, the hairs on my neck tingling so fiercely they felt like needles. That night, I attempted to sleep with all the lights in the house on, but each time I closed my eyes, I felt a cold draft slithering along the floorboards and coiling around my ankles. It felt like an invitation, or perhaps a warning. Either way, I couldn't escape the sensation that I wasn't alone. Over the next few days, my world devolved into a series of strange events. Light bulbs burned out at an alarming rate. Doors creaked open on their own, though I convinced myself it was just poor installation or the house settling. An unsteady hum buzzed through the vents, sometimes resolving into what I swore was a low chuckle. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked paler, with dark rings under the eyes, and I couldn't help but notice a certain hollowness in my expression. When I tried to watch television or listen to music, static interrupted the normal signal at random intervals, sometimes accompanied by faint whispers. None of these occurrences could be explained by simple faulty wiring or old plumbing. I felt stalked, as if the very air in my house was watching me. At one point, I decided to do a more thorough search of the old documents. If the previous owner had left warnings, perhaps there were more clues. Sifting through the musty pages, I found scattered references to sightings of a shadow moving behind walls and recurring nightmares of a drifting shape that breathes in the darkness. Handwritten notes described the occupant hearing voices through vents and feeling cold hands trailing across the back of the neck at night. The scribbles became more frantic as I flipped through them. Whoever wrote these accounts was convinced that something intangible shared the house. They mentioned hearing that same muffled laughter, seeing movement from the corners of their eyes, and feeling a presence just beyond reach. As I read, my hands began to shake so violently I could hardly steady the pages. My skin felt clammy, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. A deep-seated fear rooted inside me. The warnings were real. Something was in the house, living between the walls, drawn in by any intrusion into its domain. The final entry mentioned one instruction above all: never open the hidden hatch. Yet I had done exactly that. The fear escalated into panic. The house felt smaller, its walls pressing in, making me feel like I was being squeezed from all angles. My vision blurred occasionally at the edges, and I'd experience moments where I doubted my own perception of reality. I'd see fleeting shapes in the corners, a flicker of something tall and contorted. Whenever I tried to turn on more lights, the bulbs would flicker in protest, casting nightmarish shadows across the rooms. My heart was constantly pounding, my breaths shallow, my hands in a perpetual state of tremor. I couldn't eat. Food turned to tasteless mush in my mouth, and my throat felt as though it was constricting whenever I tried to swallow. I debated whether to leave the house entirely, but a stubborn part of me refused to abandon my own property because of some amorphous terror. I decided instead to confront it, or at least to seal that hatch once and for all. One late afternoon, as the sky outside faded into a sullen gray, I steeled myself with a surge of adrenaline and headed back to the attic. Each step up the ladder made my limbs feel heavier, as though I were trudging through water. By the time I reached the attic, my heart was pounding so loudly I feared it might burst. Still, I moved forward until I reached the trapdoor. My hands were slick with sweat as I placed a heavy padlock on it, securing the latch with as much metal as I could manage. Screws, nails, anything to keep it from opening easily. While I worked, I sensed the darkness gathering, pressing in from every corner. My flashlight seemed feeble against that overwhelming blackness. There was a moment when the attic felt so cold my breath formed small clouds. I heard a faint shuffling behind me, a soft scraping like fingernails against wood. My eyes watered from a sudden gust that smelled rancid, somewhere between mildew and stagnant water. A prickling wave of terror coursed down my spine, but I forced myself to drive each nail deeper. Every strike of the hammer reverberated with a ringing echo that seemed to carry a note of defiance. Once the final nail was in, I felt a momentary surge of triumph mixed with a dizzying rush of fear. I sensed rage in the darkness, an unseen force that recoiled at my attempts to seal it away. My ears felt pressure, a muffled pop, and I thought I caught a whisper that might have been my name, only distorted, twisted into a shape that left me trembling. I finished my makeshift barricade and fled the attic, stumbling down the ladder. My heart hammered so fiercely I had to lean against the wall just to keep from collapsing. Once downstairs, I realized how ragged my breathing had become. The entire house felt suffocating. Yet in the immediate aftermath, a fragile calm settled over me. That night, I slept in short fragments of uneasy rest. I still woke up multiple times, drenched in cold sweat, but the house was quieter. The howling wind and the eerie laughter were reduced to faint murmurs that felt distant, no longer inside the walls but banished, at least partially, to the corners of my mind. For the next few days I watched and waited, half expecting the boards to tear themselves apart or for that dreadful wind to resume. But it didn't. The nights remained disturbed. My dreams still featured that oppressive darkness and the sense of being observed, yet the experiences were less visceral. My appetite returned in small increments, and the gnawing anxiety that had taken up residence in my chest loosened its grip. I could exist in my own home without feeling the immediate urge to run. Still, whenever I passed near the attic ladder, a chill ghosted across my skin, accompanied by the memory of that muffled voice. It has been weeks since I sealed the hatch. I won't pretend my life has returned to complete normalcy. Sometimes the lights flicker inexplicably. Occasionally, I catch the faint echo of something scuttling or a breeze drifting through the walls without a discernible source. And every so often, when I'm half asleep, I feel the cold brush of air against my ear, bringing with it a vague whisper that sounds like my name. But the entity, or whatever it is, has not forced itself back into my life with the same fury as before. I still wonder if I merely postponed another encounter. The letter's words remain etched in my mind. It feeds on your fear. In quieter moments, I question my own recollections. Did I exaggerate those experiences? Was it all a product of stress, isolation, and my overactive imagination? The possibility of a mundane explanation is both comforting and disconcerting. It would be reassuring to believe I conjured the entire ordeal out of anxiety, but some deeper part of me knows that what I felt was real. The way my skin crawled in that attic, the burst of wind that flung boxes into the air, the intangible presence that whispered my name. They weren't illusions I can easily dismiss. I have no intention of ever reopening that trapdoor. Whatever dwells between the walls, wherever that corridor leads, I'd rather let it stay sealed forever. Perhaps it thrives on being acknowledged, on that fear-laced curiosity that compels us to look behind the curtain. If that's the case, my best defense is to deny it that satisfaction. Still, each time the house groans, or the air in a room grows unseasonably cold, I'm reminded that my barriers might be temporary. The oppressive weight hasn't completely vanished. It has just been subdued. At times I think I can feel it pacing, like a caged thing biding its time. Even now, the memory sends a tremor through my hands as I write this. I can feel my pulse quickening, my temples tingling with each heartbeat. I find myself glancing at the ceiling, half expecting to see a ripple in the wood or hear that unnerving chuckle again. A sense of unease lingers, refusing to dissipate entirely. I've come to accept that some scars never fully heal. This house, with all its hidden passages and unsettling secrets, has changed me. I live on the precipice between normalcy and something else, something I still struggle to name or understand. Perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. Once you've opened the door to your deepest fears, you can never completely close it again. The air in this house always felt a bit stale, but that night it was suffocating. As soon as I stepped through the front door, an almost imperceptible chill enveloped me, like icy fingers brushing the back of my neck. My skin prickled, and I had the unsettling sense that someone or something was watching from just outside my field of vision. I had lived in rentals before, but never had I felt such a persistent atmosphere of unease. Even the silence in the house seemed alive, filled with faint echoes of things unseen. If I could have turned around and left right then, I might have, but a strange mix of curiosity and dread compelled me deeper inside. I suppose it all began innocently enough. I was simply trying to get my bearings in a new place, investigating each room to familiarize myself with the layout. The main floor was unremarkable. Creaking hardwood floors, cream-colored walls, and a few empty shelves. The second floor hosted the bedrooms. Mine, at the end of a narrow hallway, felt the most comfortable at first glance. Though I was renting alone, it felt strangely lived in, as if previous tenants' presences were still clinging to the corners. Something about that notion both reassured and unsettled me. The real intrigue started when I ventured down into the basement. A single overhead light bulb buzzed and flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shift and throb along the cement walls. The basement itself was cluttered with half-rotten boxes, old furniture, and random junk that must have been accumulating for decades. I was rummaging around, looking for an extension cord I could have sworn I'd packed, when I stumbled upon a trunk tucked behind a collapsed wooden table. The trunk was scuffed, its once bright paint long faded. My heart hammered a little faster as I forced it open. Inside, I found a smaller, ornate wooden box carved with swirling designs, the patterns so intricate they seemed to move in the flickering light. When I lifted the lid, I was greeted by the stale scent of old paper and glue. There were photographs, dozens, no, hundreds of them. They were brittle and yellowed at the edges, with that distinct musty smell of something that had been forgotten for a very long time. Each photograph depicted a room, 4 walls, a bed, and a window, all arranged exactly like my current bedroom. At first I thought they might just be images of a similarly built room, but as I shuffled through them, I noticed details. The angle of the door, the distinct pattern on the window molding. It was my bedroom, or at least an earlier version of it. In these photos, the room was decorated in a bizarre fashion. Strange symbols, etched in dark paint, sprawled across the walls. Some looked like spirals or labyrinths, others like distorted runes or letters in a script I couldn't decipher. The bed was draped with an unsettling, almost ceremonial cloth. The photograph quality was poor, but the material looked glossy and dark, like wet satin. A shape often lingered in the corner, just a blur in the earliest photos. But over time it became more defined, though never more understandable. It looked vaguely humanoid, but lacked a face. In some pictures, its outline bent at unnatural angles, as if the camera had captured it mid-twitch or mid-contortion. My mouth went dry, and I realized I was breathing fast. I set the photographs aside, closed the box, then reopened it, part of me hoping I had hallucinated the images. The pictures, of course, were the same, each one more disconcerting than the last. My heart thumped so loudly in my ears that I barely registered the faint creaking noise from somewhere behind me. It might have been the wood settling or a draft moving through the basement. Yet in that moment, I felt certain I wasn't alone. I left the basement in a rush, slamming the door behind me. For hours, I tried to keep my mind off what I'd seen, distracting myself with cleaning or setting up the furniture. But my thoughts returned, over and over, to those symbols and that faceless figure. My skin tingled with the memory. I tried to reassure myself it was just a weird old trunk of junk. Maybe the photos weren't even real, or maybe they were from a stage scene for some art project. But that explanation never really settled in my gut. Later that night, I was sitting on my bed, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, but my eyes kept darting to the walls. I couldn't stop imagining the symbols from the photographs etched across the paint. Though my walls were plain, I had a suffocating sense that something was just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Sleep didn't come easily. My breathing was shallow and my temples throbbed with every heartbeat. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under, but it was a restless, haunted sleep. In my dreams, the faceless figure watched me from the corner, unmoving yet pulsating with hateful energy. I woke up drenched in sweat in the early hours of the morning, heart pounding as if I'd been running a marathon. The room was silent, but I sensed a presence just outside my line of sight. My breath came in gasps, cold sweat trickling down my neck. It took every ounce of willpower to convince myself it was only a dream. I reached over and turned on the lamp, my fingers shaking so violently that I nearly knocked it off the nightstand. In the days that followed, I tried to push my curiosity aside. The more I thought about the photographs, the stronger my discomfort grew. Yet that same compulsion that drove me to open the trunk in the first place kept gnawing at my mind. I needed to see those symbols in the context of my own space. This drive was as disturbing as it was irresistible. Finally, one evening, I decided to hold one of the oldest photos up against my bedroom wall. Maybe if I saw proof that they didn't align, I could put the matter to rest. Walking up the narrow stairs to my bedroom felt like traversing a winding path in a nightmare. Each step seemed heavier than the last. By the time I entered the room, my pulse was galloping. I clutched one photograph in my hand, the one where the walls seemed to bleed with swirling symbols. The bed in that picture looked identical to mine in shape, though the covers were tattered and dark in the image. And in the upper right corner, near where a painting now hung, the photograph revealed a specific symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward like a star gone wrong. I moved the painting aside. Immediately, my stomach dropped. Beneath the paint on the wall, faint grooves could be seen. They weren't obvious at first, just shallow indentations. But if I looked closely, I could trace something. My hands trembled as I felt the ridges under my fingertips. It matched the symbol from the photograph almost perfectly. As soon as I recognized it, a biting chill spread from my hand up my arm, like the cold was seeping into my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the photo. All rational thought told me to leave the house, to check into a motel, anything to escape. But fear immobilized me. The door behind me suddenly felt miles away, and the space around me seemed to narrow, like the walls were converging. For a brief second, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner, just a flicker of motion, but when I turned my head, nothing was there. That night, I barely slept. Every small creak in the house jolted me awake. My heart refused to settle into a normal rhythm, and my shirt clung to my sweat-drenched back. The next day, my mind was in a fog of anxiety and lack of rest. I found myself jumping at every little sound. A dripping faucet, the wind rattling the windows, the hum of the refrigerator. The sense of being watched grew stronger. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I passed a mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. At one point, I decided to consult a local historian or maybe a neighbor about the home's past. I mentioned offhand that the property seemed to have an old basement with some strange items stored away. No one offered a clear explanation, only vague remarks about the house being around for a long time, having changed owners multiple times. One person hinted that rumor claimed the house once belonged to an eccentric who held secret gatherings, though details were scarce. I noted the rumors but avoided pressing further. Something about hearing it from someone else felt too close to confirmation, and I wasn't sure I wanted that. Night after night, I dreamt of that faceless figure. Sometimes it stood by my bed, sometimes it hovered near the ceiling, and sometimes it waited in the corner. I rarely saw it move, yet I felt its presence intensify, like an electrical charge in the air. My heart pounded so fiercely in these dreams that I woke up gasping, chest tight, with adrenaline coursing through my veins. The fear was so tangible that even after waking, I felt pinned to the bed, as though invisible hands held me down. Eventually, I decided to confront the source. Staying in the bedroom felt like marinating in dread. Every nighttime moment spent there was a new experiment in terror. My logic told me that if I discovered more about those symbols, maybe they would lose their power over me. So I returned to the basement, forcing myself to open that trunk again. I laid out several of the older photographs under the weak, flickering basement light. I noticed a sequence to them. Early ones showed the room mostly empty, with just the bed and faint outlines of the symbols. As the photographs progressed, The symbols grew darker, more elaborate. An unsettling transformation took place in the space, a progression from mild disquiet to absolute horror. The faceless figure appeared near the center in later photographs, always leaning in an odd posture. Every once in a while it looked like there were multiple figures, but the images were too blurred to be certain. I found a bundle of handwritten notes tucked beneath some of the photographs. The handwriting was jagged, as if the author was either in a rush or agitated. Most of it was indecipherable, but scattered phrases leapt out. Shadows upon shadows. The Watchers. Can't sleep. Circle of warning. The air tastes bitter. I read these words, and they felt like a direct reflection of my current experience. My chest grew tight. I realized that someone before me had gone through the same descent into fear, the same suffocating paranoia. Perhaps they had tried to resist whatever influence was embedded in these walls. Or perhaps they were the reason for it. I almost didn't notice the cold creeping up my legs until I felt a prickle along my scalp. It was as though the temperature in the basement had plummeted in seconds. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a tremor start in my hands. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I became aware suddenly that I was holding my breath. In the near silence, I heard a faint scraping sound. It came from the far side of the basement, hidden behind stacks of dusty crates. Panic sparked in my chest, and I could almost feel my heart convulse against my ribs. I backed away, slowly at first, then sprinted up the stairs, slamming and locking the basement door behind me. I collapsed onto the living room couch, breath ragged, body trembling. My hands twitched involuntarily, and my mind spun with questions. Was I imagining these sounds and chills? Was the stress and lack of sleep playing tricks on me? I tried to anchor myself in reason. Possibly, old pipes or shifting floorboards caused the noises. Maybe I was so on edge that every sound felt like a threat. Yet some part of me remained convinced there was something else. Something alive, or at least active, in that house. The following night was the worst. A thunderstorm battered the town, casting lightning flashes through the windows that made the shadows sway across the walls like living shapes. The constant rumble of thunder underscored my anxiety. I sat in my bedroom with all the lights on, checking every corner, every nook, half expecting to see that shape in the flash of lightning. My heart pounded so fiercely that I felt each beat like a hammer blow in my chest, every muscle tense to the point of pain. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I couldn't bear to close them. Sometime after midnight, I felt drawn to the corner of the room. It was the same spot where, in the photos, that figure had often stood. The air in that corner felt thick, like walking through cobwebs. I noticed the floorboards there were slightly uneven, and something compelled me to pry one up. Beneath it, I found a small cavity containing a threadbare notebook. Its pages were covered with those same cryptic symbols. The final pages showed frantic scrawls that formed a rough circle, the same star-like circle I had seen behind the painting. Then, written in a hand so pressed into the paper it nearly tore, were words that might have been a plea or a warning. They read, "It's trapped but not contained. Do not remove the marks." A chill coursed through my body, and my mouth went so dry I could barely swallow. I realized that the painting had hidden a part of this symbol, as if someone was trying to keep it sealed or at least out of plain sight. Perhaps the act of discovering it, touching it, acknowledging it had somehow heightened its influence. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts, but one thing felt certain. I had to replace that painting and restore anything that might act as a barrier. I placed the notebook back in the floor cavity, hammered the board down, and returned the painting to its exact position. All the while, my heart thundered in my chest. My hands were so clammy I almost dropped the hammer. The air in the room felt charged, like static electricity before a storm. Once the painting was secure, I sensed a subtle easing of pressure, as though some invisible tension had loosened by a fraction. I stood there trembling, uncertain if I was fighting the real or the imagined. That night, I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body protesting the constant vigilance. At sunrise, with the faint light of day bringing some semblance of peace, I made a decision. I packed my essentials, clothes, toiletries, the trunk containing the photographs, and loaded my car. I wasn't going to stay in this house any longer. Whether the threat was real or the product of my own paranoia, I couldn't keep living on the edge of terror. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed sunken eyes, sweat-streaked hair, and a jaw set in grim determination. This wasn't who I wanted to be. As I drove away, the house loomed in the rearview mirror, its windows dark and inscrutable. Even from the street, I could feel its hold on me like an invisible tether. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned the corner, breaking the line of sight. A deep, rasping exhale escaped me, as if I had been holding my breath for days. Yet, as I distanced myself, I couldn't shake the lingering sensation that I was carrying something with me. A memory, a curse, or a scar left by the relentless dread. Part of me wondered if I'd ever truly escape the feeling of being watched. Though I found somewhere else to stay, the images of that faceless figure and those bizarre symbols follow me into every silence. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, I think I sense a presence standing just beyond the glow of the lamp. My pulse will spike, and cold sweat will dampen my shirt as I glance nervously around, half expecting to see that silhouette in the corner. Even in a different setting, the fear persists. I still own that trunk of photographs, locked away in a storage unit, but the knowledge of its existence weighs on me. The sense of imminent danger, of a threat that defies explanation, remains. No matter how much I tell myself it's over, I'm never fully convinced. That house, those symbols, and that faceless shape have dug into my psyche. I question whether my experiences were real, or if I slowly unraveled beneath the weight of my own anxieties. Yet every time my skin prickles at a random noise, every time I wake from a nightmare drenched in sweat, I'm reminded that some horrors leave their mark. Sometimes the most disturbing part isn't the house itself, but the idea that whatever we fear might follow us wherever we go, and perhaps it was always within us to begin with. Woke up that morning with the same faint sense of unease that had plagued my sleep the entire night. The air in my bedroom felt heavier, almost suffocating, and my heart was pounding against my ribs like a frantic drum. Even before my feet touched the floor, I knew something was off. The usual silence that blanketed the house in the early hours seemed alive, buzzing with an unseen tension. It was as if the walls were holding their breath, watching, anticipating. My mouth was painfully dry, and my skin felt clammy with perspiration. From the corner of my eye, I could swear I saw a flicker of movement in the hallway. But when I turned, there was only the dim glow of the ceiling light. That was how my morning started, steeped in an oppressive dread that I couldn't name. I've always been an early riser, motivated by my desire to watch the sunrise paint the sky in warm oranges and reds. There's something peaceful about greeting the day before the world fully wakes up. My house is situated on a large plot of land, bordered by a wide lawn that extends on 3 sides. At dawn, the grass often sparkles with dew, and when the sunlight hits it at just the right angle, it glitters like tiny crystals. Usually, stepping outside in the morning brings me comfort. The crisp scent of wet grass, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Those small joys have always anchored me in calm. But on this particular morning, I felt not the usual tranquility, but a crawling sense of discomfort I couldn't shake. Ignoring the pounding in my chest, I decided to do what I do every day: open the door, step outside, and take in the sunrise. I gently pushed the front door open, expecting to feel the cool morning breeze on my face and hear the faint chirping of distant birds. Instead, a heavy silence enveloped me the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was unsettlingly still, not even the slightest breeze to stir the trees. Worse yet, something felt wrong beneath my bare feet. The grass normally felt soft and damp at this hour, but as I stepped off the porch, it gave way under my weight in odd patches. My heart rate accelerated, and a trickle of cold sweat ran down my temple. I glanced down and saw that there were deep impressions in the ground, footprints that did not belong to me. My logical mind tried to make sense of it. Perhaps an animal had wandered through, or maybe it was some trick of the light. But these footprints were too large and too well defined to be an animal. Each mark in the grass sunk deeper than a casual step. They were spaced evenly, as if whatever made them had taken deliberate, measured steps. I bent down to get a better look, and I noticed that some blades of grass were bent sideways, as though a heavy weight had pressed down on them. The pattern led from the corner of the yard toward the side of the house, where shadows pooled in the early light. It gave me a sudden vision of a tall figure striding through my property, heading toward that darkened corner as if it belonged there. The shock of discovering these footprints ignited an anxious tension in my stomach. I felt a cool sweat break out along my forehead. My breaths grew shallow, and for a moment I considered calling someone, maybe a friend or a neighbor. But the idea of explaining this situation seemed absurd. Footprints in the grass, no sign of who or what made them, and a lingering sense of being watched. Instead, I willed myself to calm down. I forced a few slow, deliberate breaths and tried to rationalize. After all, it could be a stray trespasser passing through in the night, perhaps a drifter or someone looking for a place to hide. A chilling thought, but at least it was an explanation grounded in reality. I followed the trail of footprints until they vanished in a darker patch near the fence. A thick cluster of bushes and an old oak tree threw that corner into perpetual shade, and it felt so cold there, despite the morning sun creeping upward. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I tried to see beyond the bushes but found only more shadows. My skin crawled, and I felt the urge to step back onto the porch. When I turned around, I forced myself to scan the yard methodically. Apart from those footprints, nothing else seemed disturbed, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of invisible eyes on me. By the next day, I had almost convinced myself it was a one-time event. Maybe someone had indeed cut through my yard. I awoke, still determined to catch the sunrise, but a tightness in my chest suggested I wasn't as calm as I pretended to be. As I stood up, the boards in my bedroom floor creaked under my weight, and a sharp memory of the footprints jolted through my mind. My mouth went dry again, but I forced myself to proceed with my morning routine. I remember thinking that maybe normalcy was the best antidote to paranoia. Yet, just as I opened my front door on that second morning, I heard it. A distinct, measured thumping sound, almost like heavy boots treading across the grass. My heart lurched. Each step sounded deliberate, echoing in the silence that blanketed the property. The rhythmic crunch of grass underfoot was louder than it had any right to be. The air felt electric, as if bracing for a violent storm. My heart pounded in my ears so hard that I could barely think. When the footsteps stopped, my breath caught in my throat. I took a tentative step forward, scanning the yard, but saw nothing. Just the same trail of footprints, except this time, they snaked around the side of the house. I walked closer and saw more impressions, circumnavigating the perimeter and pausing near each window, as if something had paused there to peer inside. That mental image made my skin crawl. I was desperate for some sense of security, so I called a local hardware store to inquire about security cameras. Rather than explaining the bizarre events in detail, I simply said I needed a system that would record motion around my property. Later that day, I installed the cameras myself, placing them strategically around the porch, the corners of the house, and facing that shadowy corner in the yard. I felt a flicker of relief, convinced that if those footsteps returned, I'd have solid proof of what was happening. At the very least, I might catch a glimpse of the intruder. Nightfall brought with it a suffocating tension I hadn't felt before. Every tiny creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made my heart beat faster. I tried distracting myself with television, turning the volume up louder than usual, but it only made me more jumpy. I imagined I could hear faint scraping sounds near the windows, and each time I paused the show to listen, heart pounding, mouth going dry. When I checked the video feed from my phone app, everything appeared normal. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But at dawn, when that heavy silence descended again, the cameras failed me. I heard the same deliberate, crushing footsteps outside. My throat constricted, sweat broke out on my palms, and I found myself trembling. I lunged for my phone to check the live feed. The app simply displayed an error message, as though the cameras had lost power. My stomach sank. I rushed to the window, parted the curtains with shaking fingers, and peered out. The grass was moving in a slow ripple, as if something large was gliding across it. But I saw no figure. My breath caught in my throat when a new set of footprints suddenly appeared in the dew. Each impression formed, one after another, methodically circling the house. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as though an invisible presence was stalking around my home, evaluating each point of entry. The moment the footsteps retreated, the camera feed blinked back to life. I felt my fear turn into a nauseating frustration. Whatever this thing was, it managed to slip past my defenses as if mocking my efforts. That night, I called a friend who lived a few miles away, and I explained that strange things were happening. Footsteps in the yard, malfunctioning cameras, a sense of being watched. I remember him telling me, in a nervous laugh, that maybe I was tired or stressed. He suggested I take a break, go stay somewhere else for a few days, see if the problem went away. Deep down, I almost wanted to believe him. Yet the sinking feeling in my gut whispered that this phenomenon was not going to vanish just because I chose to ignore it. The following morning, my body felt taut like a wound spring. I woke up from a restless sleep, drenched in sweat, with my heart already hammering. Even the act of drawing the curtains made my fingers tremble. This time, when I looked outside, the footprints were everywhere, looping around the house multiple times, crossing over themselves as if something had spent the entire night circling and circling without pause. My blood ran cold. The house felt smaller, stifling, like a cage. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every muscle in my body tensed. There was no question now. Something was hunting me, or at least studying me. Determined not to be a prisoner in my own home, I ventured outside around midday. The sun was bright, banishing most of the shadows, and I thought maybe that would weaken whatever power this presence held. As I stepped onto the porch, my vision wavered momentarily. The air itself seemed to ripple, creating a mirage-like effect at the edges of the yard. A sudden wave of vertigo forced me to grab the porch railing. My heart pounded so furiously I feared I might faint. When I closed my eyes to steady myself, an icy breath of wind swept across my face, sending a shiver down my spine despite the warm sunlight. For a split second, I thought I heard low breathing behind me. A slow, almost predatory rhythm. But when I spun around, there was nothing there. That night, sleep was impossible. My bed offered no comfort, and the darkness inside my house felt alive with intangible menace. Every little shift of the floorboards made me jump, my heart banging in my chest like it wanted to escape my ribcage. Around 3 a.m., I heard a soft scraping at the back door. It wasn't a knock, it was more like a testing, like something sliding a rough surface against the wood. My throat tightened to the point of pain. I forced myself out of bed, turned on every interior light I could, and crept toward the noise. The scraping continued, deliberate and unhurried. My breathing was so loud in my own ears that it drowned out almost everything else. When I finally reached the door, I peered through the peephole. At first, all I saw was darkness, then a movement, a subtle shift of shadows. Cold sweat trickled down my face, and I felt my heartbeat falter. There was nothing recognizable, no human silhouette, no animal shape. Just a faint impression of space twisting as if reality itself were bending. I went back to the camera monitors, and of course they were offline yet again. Each new wave of fear made me break into fresh cold sweat. My limbs felt shaky, my palms clammy, and my mouth was as dry as sand. In that moment, it felt like the entire house was closing in on me. I could practically feel the walls constrict, pressing closer until my breathing became shallow gasps. I questioned my own sanity. Perhaps I was hallucinating, or maybe stress had triggered some form of paranoid delusion. Yet the physical evidence, those footprints, the malfunctioning cameras, that scraping sound, told me this was far more than just my mind unraveling. I spent the next day in a fog of panic, my senses on high alert to every flicker of movement, every suspicious noise. It was as though a part of my brain had gone primal, scanning the environment for threats like a cornered animal. My paranoia swelled to the point that I couldn't trust my own reflections in mirrors. Several times, I caught a glimpse of myself, only to feel an electric jolt of fear, half expecting to see something else staring back. The yard, once my source of morning solace, now felt like a field of lurking possibilities where each blade of grass hid an unseen threat. As the sun set once again, I decided I couldn't remain passive. I locked every door, latched every window, and armed myself with a high-powered flashlight. I hoped that confronting this presence under a bright beam would strip it of its mystery. The moment darkness fell, I stationed myself by the window overlooking the front yard. My heart was a thunderous beat in my chest, and every breath felt like I was inhaling razor blades. Time dragged, each minute a marathon of tension. Then, when the clock struck midnight, the house went eerily quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to vanish. My pulse roared in my ears, and I braced myself for the familiar footsteps. They came, slow and deliberate, crunching the grass in the exact same rhythm I had dreaded. I steeled myself, threw open the front door, and shone the flashlight into the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape, a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from asphalt. It moved, but not in a way any normal creature would. My body froze. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it rattling my entire torso. I struggled to keep my grip on the flashlight, my palms slick with sweat. The shape drifted toward the side of the house, then vanished into the deeper shadows. The footsteps continued, circling me, but I couldn't pinpoint their source. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and a wave of lightheadedness nearly dropped me to my knees. I don't know how long I stood there, flashlight scanning left and right, seeing only flickers of movement at the edges of my vision. Eventually, the footsteps faded. Slowly, the normal night sounds returned. Crickets chirping, distant wind in the trees. My body felt drained of energy. Every muscle quivered from the exertion of terror. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and I realized I had been gritting my teeth so hard that my jaw ached. Stumbling back inside, I had no sense of relief, just a haunting awareness that something had tested my boundaries and let me live with the knowledge that it could do so again whenever it wished. I sank into a chair, flashlight still trembling in my grasp, and tried to catch my breath. That was the first time I truly acknowledged that this thing, whatever it was, held the upper hand. By the time morning arrived, I felt like I had aged a decade in a single night. My face in the mirror showed a pallor and tension I had never seen before. The footprints were scattered all around the house, as expected, but now I noticed that they formed odd symbols in certain places, almost like patterns or runes etched into the grass. A nauseating dread twisted my stomach at the thought that this entity might be marking its territory or sending a message. I realized in a cold jolt of clarity that I needed to leave. Not forever, perhaps, but at least long enough to gather my wits and see if distance would grant me any peace. I tossed some essentials into a bag, my hands shaking so badly it took me twice as long as usual. As I walked toward my car, each step felt like I was wading through knee-deep water. My vision seemed to tunnel, the edges of my sight blurred. I half expected to feel a heavy hand on my shoulder or see footprints forming right behind me, but the yard remained deceptively still. The moment I slid into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and glanced around, expecting some final confrontation. Yet the property was empty under the morning sun, looking deceptively normal except for those deep impressions in the grass. With the engine running, I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My heart thumped in my chest, a steady reminder of the fear that still coursed through my veins. I felt no triumph, only lingering dread. Something was out there, and it wasn't limited by walls or doors. It had studied me, circled me like a predator circles its prey. As I pulled away from the house, I caught a glimpse of that dark corner in the yard. The shadow there almost seemed to pulse, like a living thing. Although I managed to drive away, relief did not fill me. Instead, a new terror arose. I was leaving my home under the watchful gaze of something that might follow me anywhere. Even on the open road, I felt its presence clinging to me like a cold sweat. An oppressive certainty weighed on me that this was far from over. I was fleeing, yes, but I wasn't escaping. The morning sun offered no warmth, only sharp light that highlighted every anxious tremor in my body and every question gnawing at my psyche. Had I really seen something impossible, or had my mind twisted mundane events into a nightmare? Would it be waiting for me if I ever dared return? When I finally turned onto the main highway, the house receded behind me, little more than a speck in the rearview mirror. Yet the tension in my chest refused to ease. I found myself glancing at the mirrors, half convinced I would see that shimmer in the air following close behind. Every shadow that passed over the road made my pulse spike. My mouth was still bone dry, my breathing shallow. Despite feeling safer by the second, I couldn't shake the sensation that my ordeal was only beginning, that I was bringing a piece of that nightmare with me wherever I went. Now, as I write these words from a borrowed place, I'm haunted by the memory of those footsteps in the dew. The rational part of my mind keeps trying to label this experience as a mere series of coincidences, but my body remembers the paralyzing dread. My heart still races at the faintest reminder of those measured steps, or the distorted shapes at the edge of my vision. I survived the ordeal, but I can't say I escaped it. There's a lingering presence in my thoughts, a cold, spectral feeling that grips me without warning. Even here, I sometimes look at the floor and expect to see footprints forming out of thin air. Whatever I encountered, it shattered the fragile illusion of safety I'd constructed around my life. I'm left with an unshakable sense of being watched, a constant prickling at the back of my neck. Even though I managed to drive away from that house, the oppressive fear remains lodged in my mind. My freedom feels hollow, overshadowed by the knowledge that something out there defies my comprehension. And late at night, I lie awake, imagining that same measured tread circling this new house, stepping through every doorway of my psyche until there's nowhere left for me to hide. A single beam of pale light filtered through the high windows, casting twisted shadows across the worn wooden floor. I remember the way my heartbeat seemed to echo off the stone walls, as if the very architecture of that library recognized my anxiety. My breath grew shallow the moment I stepped in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something far older than the stacks of antique books was watching me. Right from the start, there was this undercurrent of dread, like an invisible hand pressing against my spine. It tightened my chest and made every movement feel like I was intruding in a place that belonged to something else. I had volunteered at the library to help restore old tomes that hadn't been touched in decades. The building was at least 100 years old, though some people whispered that certain parts of it dated back even further. I never found any official record about that, but I did notice architectural details that seemed more like remnants from a distant era. My task was relatively simple on paper: catalog and repair battered volumes, rebind spines, and remove centuries of accumulated dust. Initially, the idea thrilled me. I've always been fond of history, and handling antique texts felt like peering through a window into the past. However, from the very first week, something about those silent halls unsettled me. During the day, the place was simply quiet, like a sanctuary of knowledge. Sunlight would streak in through stained glass, painting the reading desks in shifting colors. The hush could be comforting, broken only by the scratch of a pencil or the shuffle of an occasional visitor. But after the sun dipped below the horizon, an oppressive chill crept in. The few overhead lights made everything look washed out and unnatural, and the shadows between the shelves grew denser, almost like they had weight. Each step I took in those corridors felt like stepping into a place where my presence wasn't welcome. The head librarian, an older man with a perpetually stern expression, told me early on that I was free to stay after hours if I wanted a quiet environment for the restoration work. He mentioned in passing that nobody else would be around at that time, so I could concentrate. I recall him adding in a low voice that I should be careful not to strain my eyes in the dim light. He didn't say much else, only that I could find him the next morning if I needed anything. I nodded, but there was a tension in the way he spoke, as though he was politely warning me of something best left unspoken. I brushed the caution aside at first. The first few nights went by uneventfully, except for an odd creak or two from the rafters above. I assumed it was merely the old building settling. But then came the whispering. It started as a vague rustling at the edge of my hearing, too faint to pinpoint. I would look up from my work, certain I'd heard a voice just behind me, only to see nothing but the outlines of tall bookshelves. My heart would thump, but I forced myself to write it off as the breeze passing through cracks in the walls, or maybe my own imagination. The next evening, however, I noticed the whispers again, but they seemed a bit louder, like a soft chorus of hushed voices drifting down from higher shelves. I told myself it might be the air vents or the building's old pipes, yet I couldn't ignore the chills crawling over my skin. My hands would tremble a little as I turned pages, and I'd find myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes the hair on the back of my neck stood up, as though I were being observed by someone just out of sight. I tried to push aside the discomfort. After all, I had a job to do, and I took pride in carefully mending each fragile page. But the more I immersed myself in that quiet, the stronger the atmosphere became. I'd catch a movement in the corner of my eye, like a flicker of a shadow skipping across the upper balconies. Then there was the odd sensation of cold that would sweep by when I was bent over a desk. It was unlike the normal chill of a drafty building. This was sharper, almost invasive, and it left me with goosebumps that lingered far too long. One evening, I thought I saw a shape near the end of a corridor. It was tall and narrow, but before I could fully register it, the lights flickered and the shape vanished. My chest constricted with a sudden panic, and I had to pause, leaning against a shelf for support. I remember my breath getting stuck in my throat, and I fought the urge to drop everything and run. Instead, I walked slowly, placing one foot in front of the other, determined to prove to myself that nothing was really there. Of course, when I reached that spot, I found empty air and silent shelves. On the nights that followed, I could have sworn I felt the presence more acutely. Sometimes I would be alone in the reading room, and a gentle breeze would pass by, carrying with it the faint smell of old paper and something bitter, like charred wood. My heart would pound so loudly that I was certain anyone nearby, if there were anyone, could hear it. That gnawing feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was as though the library itself had eyes in every corner. Still, I pressed on with my volunteer work. By the time midnight rolled around, I would be so engrossed in the delicate task of repairing loose pages that I would forget about my unease momentarily. Yet the moment the clock struck 12, an inexplicable change settled over the building. The shadows seemed darker, the whispers grew bolder. Sometimes I distinctly heard my own name in the hush, carried along the corridors like a taunt. My throat would tighten, and a bead of cold sweat would dribble down my temple. Each time I wrestled with the temptation to pack up and leave for the night. It was on a particularly cold and moonless night that I experienced the most jarring encounter. I was finishing the binding of a rare history volume when I heard a soft but rapid flipping sound. It was as if someone else in the library was frantically skimming through the pages of a heavy tome. The sound persisted, growing louder, and I followed it to a dimly lit corner by a large wooden table. When I reached it, my stomach clenched. The pages of a hefty manuscript were turning on their own. There was no breeze, no open window, just the furious movement of paper as though a pair of invisible hands devoured the text. My immediate reaction was to freeze. Every muscle in my body tightened, and I felt my heart thud painfully against my ribcage. My vision narrowed, and for a fleeting instant, I wondered if I was fainting. It took a force of will to step closer, but I managed to inch forward until I was only a few feet away from the table. The pages continued to flip, slower now, almost deliberate. I was torn between a powerful urge to bolt and a nagging curiosity about what might be causing this. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and my mouth went dry. Then it stopped. The manuscript lay open on a page that displayed an old illustration, a strange figure surrounded by cryptic symbols. My skin crawled just looking at it, and I couldn't decipher the text. It was in some language I had never seen. My fingers itched to touch the page, but before I could, I heard a distinct thump from behind me. Startled, I whirled around. The shelves along the wall began to tremble, as if shaken by some internal tremor. Dust cascaded from the highest shelves, drifting through the thin light like ghosts. My mind screamed that I should run, but I stood rooted to the spot for a heartbeat longer. That was when a sudden blast of icy air surged through the corridor. It rushed over me, making me gasp, and I nearly stumbled backward. The cold felt alive, more like a claw than a simple gust. It gnawed at the exposed skin of my face and hands, and I had to brace myself against the table to keep from falling. The sensation lasted just a few seconds, but it left me trembling from head to toe. My teeth chattered, and my eyes stung as though the cold had cut right through them. Fear finally snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned on my heel and raced toward the nearest staircase. My pulse hammered in my ears, and each step felt precarious, as if the floor might collapse beneath me. The rapid staccato of my footsteps echoed through the library, and for a moment, I imagined something chasing me, some entity skimming along the edges of the shelves. I refused to look back. Instead, I sprinted down the stairs, taking 2 or 3 steps at a time, until I reached the heavy front doors. Once outside, the night air seemed strangely warm compared to the chill I'd just fled. I realized I was shaking so badly that I had to rest a hand against the stone exterior of the building to steady myself. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and the adrenaline pounding in my veins made it difficult to think straight. After a few moments, I forced myself to walk away, unable to keep from glancing over my shoulder to see if the library still looked normal. It did, an imposing gray structure under the glow of streetlights, silent as ever. But I knew what I had experienced inside was not a product of my imagination. I didn't return until dawn broke the next day. The morning sun gave the ancient library an almost serene appearance, and for a second, I questioned the memory of the night before. My exhaustion felt unreal, like I had traveled a great distance in a matter of hours, and my mind was left half broken from the journey. Yet the marks of dust on my clothes and the lingering chill in my bones confirmed that it wasn't a nightmare. It was very real. I had one last task to complete: to finalize the inventory of the newly restored volumes and deliver the records to the head librarian. My stomach churned when I opened the doors and stepped inside, but in the morning light, everything seemed ordinary. No trembling shelves, no flipping pages. I gathered my tools and papers with shaking hands, keeping my eyes locked on the ground, doing my best to ignore the shelves that stretched into dim corners. The slightest sound made me flinch, but all I could hear was the soft hum of the ventilation system. While preparing the final paperwork, I overheard the head librarian speak to a colleague in a hushed tone. They seemed concerned about my work hours, wondering aloud if I found the environment eerie. I pretended not to listen, but from their cautious words, I inferred that I wasn't the first to experience strange happenings at night. They never mentioned details, just that volunteers rarely stayed after midnight for long. A cold sweat trickled down my spine as I packed the last stack of books, silently vowing to never return after sundown. Before leaving for the final time, I took one more look around the main hall. The tall shelves, the ancient wooden desks, and the countless books bound in faded covers. During the day, it was a silent treasury of knowledge. But lurking just beneath that calm surface, I sensed a force that defied explanation. Even the beams of sunlight couldn't banish the memories of what I had witnessed. The frantic flipping pages, the violent quaking of the shelves, and that devastatingly cold gust of air that felt almost alive. On my way out, my gut twisted with one last disturbing thought. Maybe the library wanted me to see those things. There was an intelligence behind it all, something that watched from the corners. Whether it was a supernatural entity, The echo of past patrons, or some darker presence feeding off the accumulated knowledge, I couldn't say, but I felt convinced that it had beckoned me deeper and deeper into its secrets, then cast me out in a burst of icy terror. I left the building with my head low, shoulders tense, the echoes of the unseen corridor still ringing in my ears. Even after I stepped into the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had carried something out with me, an invisible weight pressing on my chest, a faint whisper looping at the edge of my consciousness. And as I walked away for the last time, I realized that no amount of sunshine could fully dispel the memory of those cryptic pages turning on their own, or the silent promise hidden in the shadows of that century-old library. I still shudder when I recall the heavy thump of the shelves and that numbing cold that seemed to claw at my very soul. The nights I spent there continue to haunt me, and I've given up trying to dismiss them as hallucinations or the product of an overworked mind. I can't forget the sense that something was searching through those books at the same time I was restoring them, something that wasn't human and had no place in the world of the living. To this day, I sometimes dream of those corridors and that dark table with pages whipping by of their own accord. In those dreams, the library corridors stretch on forever, and the oppressive hush grows so loud it's almost deafening. When I wake, my heart is racing, my sheets are damp with sweat, and I'm left staring at the ceiling, feeling the lingering traces of cold on my skin. No matter how many times I remind myself that I escaped that place without physical harm, the dread remains etched into my psyche. I often wonder if someday, after I've finally convinced myself that it was all an elaborate trick of the mind, I'll feel that same Arctic gust on the back of my neck. Perhaps I'll hear those voices again, whispering from distant shelves. The only thing I know for sure is that I'll never step foot in that library after dark. The experience left a stain on my sense of reality, an inescapable suspicion that the boundary between our world and something else is dangerously thin in certain places, and that knowledge gnaws at me. Whenever I pass an old building or see a closed door, I wonder what might lie dormant beyond the threshold. I think about how many institutions, libraries, or archives carry secrets not meant for human eyes. In my case, the threat was enough to force me out, but I can't help but feel that the library's presence never quite let me go. The memory alone is enough to make me catch my breath in the middle of the night, haunted by the thought that the next time I hear a whisper in a quiet room, it might be calling me back. I still remember the sterile glow of the overhead lights, how they seemed too bright and too dim at the same time that night. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sputter from an ancient printer no one had bothered to switch off. I had stayed late before, but that evening felt different from the moment I stepped into the corridor. The air was heavier, carrying a faint, sharp odor, like something metallic left to stagnate. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was the usual stale office air, but it clung to my senses, setting my nerves on edge. My name is Matthew, and I was once a devoted project manager in a mid-sized marketing firm. I prided myself on my focus, my dedication, and my willingness to go the extra mile. If a colleague or supervisor ever questioned my commitment, I would work additional hours without complaint, just to prove I could handle it. That night was no different, or so I believed. The only unusual element was the uneasy tightness in my chest that started as soon as the last of my coworkers said their goodbyes. Once I heard the elevator doors slide shut behind them, I realized I was truly alone on that floor. That lingering hush made the entire place feel abandoned, like a deserted labyrinth of cubicles and conference rooms. I had a report to finalize and an early deadline, so I pushed aside my discomfort and settled at my desk. The computer's screen cast a cold, bluish light against my face, which only intensified the darkness surrounding the far corners of the office. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the silhouette of a security guard making rounds. But I never heard footsteps, or saw the faintest shadow of movement. It was just me, a weak overhead fixture, and the flickering glare of my monitor. At first, I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks. I typed up a few paragraphs of my report, reread them, and edited for clarity. I opened spreadsheets, checked charts, and meticulously crafted language that would impress my supervisors. Yet I found myself pausing frequently, my heart pounding as if I had just run up a flight of stairs. There was no immediate reason for my anxiety, no visible threat, no alarming sound or flicker of light, but it grew more insistent with each passing minute. My breath became shallow, and a film of sweat formed under my collar, despite the air conditioning's chill. A few hours later, around 9:30 if I recall correctly, I first heard it. A low scraping sound, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. It was distant and muffled, coming from the opposite end of the corridor near the conference rooms. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I reasoned maybe the cleaning staff had arrived and were moving chairs around to vacuum. There was no direct speech from them, no greetings, no casual chatter. Usually they at least announced themselves so as not to startle anyone still working. That night all I heard was a single scraping noise, then silence. I remember standing up from my desk, my legs a little shaky, and deciding to investigate. The corridor lighting was always uneven because half the bulbs had burned out and never got replaced. Each step I took made a hollow echo. The silence was so complete that I could clearly hear my own pulse in my ears, like a steady drumbeat urging me to turn around. I considered stopping in my tracks and returning to my workspace, but something compelled me forward. Maybe it was curiosity or a desire to confirm I wasn't losing my grip. I reached the conference room door and paused. Through the small rectangular window set into the door, I saw shapes, tables and chairs stacked in a bizarre formation. It was as though someone had taken every piece of furniture in the room and jammed it against the door, building a chaotic barricade. In the dim light, the legs of chairs jutted out at odd angles, and tabletop edges formed a jagged outline against the glass. My first thought was that this was some elaborate prank, but I couldn't imagine any coworker staying so late just to spook me. Besides, there had been no laughter, no half-hidden voices. It was too quiet for any practical joke. Placing my palm on the glass, I felt cold sweat accumulating on my forehead. My heart thumped so forcefully that it almost hurt. My mind raced. Who would have done this? The barricade looked purposeful, yet haphazard, as if constructed in desperate haste. I pressed my ear to the door, and for a few seconds, I heard nothing but the rush of my own blood. Then, in the stillness, I caught the faintest shuffle, as though something brushed against the far wall. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, metal ducts creaking, maybe the air system activating. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I gripped the doorknob and turned it. The door was locked from the inside. A sinking feeling took hold of me. I glanced around, expecting to see a crowbar or maybe a piece of metal that could help me pry it open. But the corridor was empty. I stood there, uncertain whether I should call someone. The security guard might have gone on his break. My boss certainly wouldn't appreciate a late-night phone call. I decided to check the adjoining conference room to see if the wall partition was open, providing another way inside. That's when I heard that unmistakable scraping again, closer this time, right inside the barricaded room. It sounded like wood against tile, slow and arduous, as if it took great effort to move. My teeth clenched so hard I felt my jaw start to ache. There was a primal urge in me to flee back to my desk, grab my things and run for the elevator. But I couldn't. Something about that locked room, that barricade of chairs and tables, demanded an explanation. I found the adjoining conference room door slightly ajar. No lights were on inside, and the overhead fixture in the hallway did a poor job illuminating more than a few feet beyond the threshold. Still, I stepped in. The thick carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps, and the darkness felt oppressive, as though it had weight and substance. The hush in the air pressed in on me. Each breath I took seemed thunderously loud. My palms were slick with perspiration, my throat so dry that swallowing sent a painful jolt down my neck. A sense of being watched crept up the back of my spine. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. My eyes struggled to adjust to the shadows, but no figure appeared. The only movement was my reflection in the window at the far side of the room. tinted gray by the outdoor city lights. My reflection looked distorted, almost unrecognizable, a trembling silhouette with wide, fearful eyes. For a moment I was struck by the possibility that I might be hallucinating or letting my imagination run wild. I moved carefully toward the partition that separated this conference room from the barricaded one. A sliding track along the ceiling held the partition in place, but it wasn't fully extended. There was a small gap of a few inches near the far corner. If I squeezed close enough and leaned in, I might see what lay beyond. Bending down, I peered through the gap. Initially, all I made out was a tangle of chair legs. My heart jolted when I noticed one of those legs shift, as if pulled by something unseen. The faint scraping resumed, much louder now, directly in front of me. Every muscle in my body tensed. My skin felt clammy, as if I were running a fever. My heart hammered so violently that my vision blurred for an instant. I tried to rationalize. Maybe there was someone in there who needed help, though the idea of silently stacking furniture seemed too strange to be a simple accident. The fear twisting in my gut made me wonder if I should call out or keep my silence. Ultimately, I whispered a cautious greeting, though my voice sounded weak and hoarse. No answer came. Instead, I heard a soft, rasping sound, a slow exhalation of air. It resembled a long, ragged sigh, filled with an indescribable weariness. Shaken, I carefully backed away from the partition. My instincts screamed that I needed to leave, that whatever was happening in that room was not natural. Yet a stubborn part of me insisted on investigating. I couldn't simply turn my back on what might be a break-in or some distressed person trapped under furniture. Gathering every shred of nerve, I decided to return to the hallway and attempt to force my way through the barricade from the main conference room door. The corridor felt colder than before, and the overhead lights flickered momentarily, casting strange, jumping shadows on the walls. My pulse still pounded mercilessly. I couldn't seem to get enough air, and my lungs burned with each short, panicked breath. When I reached the door, the mass of furniture was still there, piled even higher than I remembered, as if it had grown in the few minutes I'd been gone. It almost reached the top of the doorframe now, and part of me swore I hadn't seen it so tall earlier. I grabbed a chair leg that protruded from the stack and tried to pull it free. At first, it barely budged. Then it shifted an inch or two, enough to give me hope. I yanked harder, sinking my weight into the motion. That was when I felt the resistance. It wasn't just the weight of the furniture. It felt like a force on the other side, tugging back, preventing me from moving anything. The shock of it sent a jolt through my arms. My heart stuttered in my chest, and a cold flush swept over me, making me break out in goosebumps. It truly felt like invisible hands were gripping the other side, matching my strength. A moment later, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered again, plunging the corridor into half-darkness. My breath caught in my throat. In that split second of dim illumination, I saw the furniture shift from the inside, as though something pushed it outward. Then the lights blinked on again, and everything was still. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I stood there panting, sweat dripping down my temples, my entire body trembling. A sound rose from behind the barricade, a long, hollow moan that scraped at my eardrums. It was neither loud nor shrill. Instead, it was coarse and raw, like the final rasp of someone on the brink of losing their voice. The very timbre of that moan resonated in my bones, triggering a primal fear I had never experienced before. My eyes filled with tears, unbidden, and my mouth went so dry that I struggled to swallow. I didn't wait to find out what made that noise. The combination of that invisible resistance, the flickering lights, and the impossible arrangement of desks and chairs was too much. My mind roared with an urgent command. Get out now. I let go of the furniture and stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing. In a matter of seconds, I was sprinting down the corridor. My heart pounded so fiercely that I felt a pressing ache in my chest. My ears rang with the echo of that moan. The elevator took an agonizingly long time to arrive. As I stood there, jabbing the call button repeatedly, I could almost feel something lurking behind me. I refused to look back. My entire body shook with adrenaline, and I fought the urge to bolt down the stairs instead. When the doors finally opened, I threw myself inside and slammed the close button. The instant they slid shut, a suffocating weight seemed to lift off my shoulders, as though whatever presence haunted that corridor was bound to stay behind. In the lobby, the security desk was empty. I considered searching for the guard, but decided it was best to leave immediately. After all, I couldn't articulate what I had seen in a way that would sound rational. No one would believe that furniture was moving on its own, or that I heard a moan with no person behind it. My heart still thundered, and my arms felt weak, almost numb from the frantic effort of trying to pull the barricade apart. Outside, the city lights felt harsh and overly bright. The normalcy of traffic and the occasional passerby only heightened the unreality of what I had just experienced. I realized I was drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. My reflection in a nearby glass window revealed wild eyes and a pallid face. I looked like someone who had escaped a nightmare. That's exactly how I felt. I went straight home without any intention of returning to the office before sunrise. Even once safe in my apartment, I couldn't calm down. My mind buzzed with questions. Had I imagined it all? Could there be a natural explanation? An earthquake tremor, a bizarre prank, a faulty door lock? But deep down, I knew none of those answers rang true. When I closed my eyes, all I could see was that twisted barricade and feel that impossible pull resisting me. In the following days, I kept replaying the incident in my head. Whenever coworkers asked me about the final version of the report or made casual remarks about office life, I had to feign normalcy. I never admitted that I fled the building in a panic or that I believed something otherworldly occupied that locked conference room. I considered telling my boss that I refused to work past a certain hour, but I couldn't give a reason without sounding unstable. Instead, I simply avoided any tasks that might force me to remain alone after dark. If a project demanded extra time, I took it home. I no longer felt safe in that building, especially when the corridors emptied and the lights seemed a little too dim. The strangest part was how no one else reported anything amiss. The furniture in the conference room was back to its normal arrangement by the next morning. A colleague mentioned that the cleaning crew had complained about a mess one evening, but no specifics were given. I tried to imagine them walking in on that grotesque barricade. Did they see any signs of a presence? Or did they simply find the furniture scattered around with no explanation for how it got that way? I never mustered the courage to ask. A few times I overheard the cleaning staff speaking in low voices about weird occurrences, like hearing scratching noises or feeling sudden cold drafts near the storage closets. They never directly approached me, but I caught glimpses of their uneasy faces from across the hallway. Every so often I found myself doubting the details of that night. It would have been easier to convince myself it was a vivid hallucination, the product of stress and exhaustion. Yet certain sensations stayed with me. The ache in my arms from pulling at the furniture, the dryness in my throat, the unmistakable moan that still echoed in my nightmares. However surreal it all seemed, I couldn't completely dismiss it. Eventually, I chose to resign from that firm. Officially, I cited a better opportunity elsewhere, though it was mostly to preserve my own sanity. I continued to have occasional nightmares, dreams of walking down that dim corridor, hearing scraping noises behind every closed door. In those dreams, I never quite made it to the exit. The walls seemed to stretch infinitely, and the lights flickered just enough to disorient me. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding as violently as it had on that real night. To this day, I avoid working late wherever I am. If deadlines loom, I take my tasks home or arrive early in the morning instead. Something in me changed permanently that night. I can't unhear that ragged moan or forget the feeling of a force pulling back from the other side. Whether it was my mind fracturing under pressure or something beyond rational explanation, I'm not sure. But I do know one thing. The dread I felt was more intense than any ordinary fear. It crawled under my skin and lodged itself in my psyche, a lingering reminder that some places, especially in the hush of after hours, are better left undisturbed. I still feel a flutter of panic whenever I step into a quiet office corridor. My senses sharpen, and I become hyper-aware of every subtle shift of light or distant rustle of movement. It doesn't help that so many office buildings share the same sterile hallways and flickering fluorescence. Sometimes I half expect to hear that scraping noise start up again behind a locked door. In those moments, my chest tightens, and cold sweat beads at my temples. Perhaps it's paranoia, or perhaps part of me knows that what happened once can happen again. No matter how hard I try to rationalize it, the sensation of those invisible hands resisting me has never left my mind. It's like an imprint burned into my memory, a permanent scar that defies logic. Occasionally, I ask myself if I should have tried harder to see who or what was behind that barricade. Could I have helped? Or was it something that was never human to begin with? Something that thrives on emptiness and late-night silence. Even now, recalling it sets my nerves on edge. I can almost smell that stale metallic scent in the air and feel the flimsy plastic chairs sliding against my sweaty palms. The mind is powerful, but so are the unknowns that lurk in the corners of our waking world. Maybe the scariest realization isn't that there was something supernatural in that room, but that I can't be sure there wasn't. That uncertainty gnaws at me. I have no intention of finding out. I left that office for good and never looked back. No more late nights, no more solitary hours in those echoing corridors. And if I ever catch even a distant hint of that dragging noise again, I'll drop everything and run, just as I did that night. Because some doors are better left closed, especially when they're barricaded from the inside by hands you cannot see. From the moment I first stepped into that massive gray warehouse, I felt as if the walls themselves were watching me. The air seemed heavier than normal, pressing in on my lungs the second I walked through the doors. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead in short, spasmodic bursts, making even the shadows quiver as if they held secrets. Every night I closed the place. I could swear something lingered in the corners of my vision, something I couldn't name but felt in the pit of my stomach. Little did I know that what started as an intangible dread would soon unfold into a waking nightmare, one I've never truly escaped. I've been working in that warehouse for several months now. On the surface, it's just a cavernous space filled with towering metal shelves, row after row of crates and boxes stacked high. During the day, it bustles with forklifts beeping and colleagues chatting about football games or weekend plans. But as the sun goes down and most people punch out, the atmosphere changes drastically. The heavy hum of machinery dies out, replaced by a silence so thick it feels like a living entity. The only sound is the echo of my footsteps across the concrete floor. Each thud resonates in my chest, amplifying my growing unease. Not long after I started, I overheard some of the older employees swap stories during a lunch break. They spoke in hushed tones about a spectral figure rumored to roam the darker sections of the warehouse, especially near the far end of the main corridor. It was said to appear as a man in worn-out janitorial clothes, silently sweeping the floor between the dusty shelves. A few people claimed they had seen it from the corner of their eyes, but whenever they tried to approach, the figure would vanish. Some co-workers dismissed it as nonsense or tired eyes playing tricks under bad lighting. Others insisted there was something very real lurking back there. Initially, I tried to brush off these tales. I considered them urban legends meant to spook the new guy. However, the repeated mentions tugged at my curiosity. Each time someone brought it up, I felt a jolt in my chest, as though my heart was reminding me to stay alert. The stories became impossible to ignore when one of my colleagues, while restocking shelves late one evening, claimed to have locked eyes with the sweeping figure. According to him, the man's motions were oddly repetitive, like an old film reel stuck on the same frame. He only glimpsed it for a few seconds before it disappeared behind a row of crates. That night, I went home with a knot in my stomach, replaying the story in my mind until sleep finally claimed me. I'm not the superstitious type, but I'm also not the sort to laugh off a room full of nervous employees. Over time, I began to notice subtle oddities around the warehouse. Shadows seemed to stretch out in ways that defied the angle of the overhead lights. Sometimes the air carried a faint scent of must and old cleaning supplies, even in areas where no one had mopped or swept in ages. My pulse would pick up, and I'd find myself looking over my shoulder for no apparent reason. Each day, my anxiety grew like a stubborn weed I couldn't pull out. One night, I decided to stay later than usual to finish some paperwork. Most people had already clocked out, and the warehouse sank into that eerie hush again. My workstation, a metal desk bolted near the center of the storage area, was just close enough to the corridor where sightings supposedly occurred. I couldn't stop my eyes from wandering toward that dark stretch. The overhead lights there always seemed dimmer, as if something was siphoning power away. Goosebumps prickled my arms, and my breath came in shallow pulls. I tried to focus on the spreadsheets in front of me, but every small noise made my heart hammer. A distant clang echoed from somewhere in the labyrinth of shelves, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. Exhaling, I told myself it was just a crate settling or a forklift platform shifting. Determined to conquer my fear, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check that back corridor. My stomach churned with a mixture of dread and odd excitement, some primal drive to see if these rumors held any truth. Stepping among the tall rows, I noticed that the air felt colder. My breath caught in my throat, turning ragged. Each step brought me deeper into shadows that seemed to ripple along the walls. The flashlight beam wobbled slightly in my trembling hand, revealing rows of shelving that looked more like jagged teeth than metal racks. My palms were slick with sweat, and a chill skittered along my spine. Then I saw him. The figure materialized at the very end of the corridor, exactly where people had reported. He wore a gray jumpsuit, stained and faded, as though it had been worn daily for years without a single wash. His head was slightly bowed, and he clutched a long-handled broom. At first he seemed oblivious to me, methodically sweeping in slow, jerky arcs. I froze, my mouth going bone dry. I hadn't expected to actually see anything, certainly not in such detail. Time warped. My heart pounded so loud it thundered in my ears. My vision tunneled on this silent sweeper. Each motion he made was repetitive, looping over the same patch of concrete. It was like watching a video glitch, his arms and torso resetting to the exact same posture again and again. My nerves screamed for me to run, yet a perverse curiosity glued me to the spot. I tried to call out, but my voice wouldn't obey. My chest tightened, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my temples. Summoning what courage I could, I took a single step forward. The concrete underfoot felt like it was trembling, or maybe that was just my legs quivering. The moment my boot scraped the floor, the figure jerked upright. Then, in a fluid, impossible motion, it floated backward, its feet never leaving the ground, but somehow gliding inches above it. A harsh breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure dissolve into a faint cloud of dust, scattering as though carried by an unseen wind. All that remained was the echo of my pounding heart and an unsettling hush that pressed in even heavier than before. I stood there, legs shaking, struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I don't remember the walk back to my desk. My mind was a tangle of panic and disbelief, replaying the sight of that figure moving in unnatural staccato movements. I barely managed to gather my things before fleeing the building. In the parking lot, I stood by my car and realized I was breathing as if I had just run a marathon. My skin felt clammy, and my stomach rolled with nausea. The magnitude of what I'd seen refused to fade, burning itself into my memory. For the next few nights, sleep came reluctantly. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that slow, looping sweep, the grainy, repetitive motion that reminded me of a scratched DVD stuck on a single scene. My nerves were frayed, and I noticed I was starting to jump at small sounds in my apartment, pipes clanking or the fridge humming. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed dark circles under my eyes, a testament to restless nights spent wrestling with my thoughts. At work, I overheard more chatter about sightings. I said nothing, but it was evident I wasn't alone in experiencing strange occurrences. Some people mentioned hearing the faint sound of a broom's bristles scraping against concrete, even when no janitors were scheduled. Others reported feeling a sudden drop in temperature by the far shelves. I grew acutely aware of every detail: the flicker of a dying light, the echo of a distant metallic clank, the hush that descended in the corridor. My paranoia began to bloom. Each shift, I felt watched, as though invisible eyes followed my every move. One particular evening, I stayed later than usual again, determined to finish an inventory count. Despite my dread, I had no choice. The job needed completion. I stationed myself near the front of the warehouse this time, but that oppressive silence still seeped into my bones. The overhead lights buzzed, and somewhere a gust of air from the HVAC system rattled a loose panel. My pulse thrummed in my ears, and I tried to focus on scanning barcodes without letting my mind wander. Somewhere around midnight, I heard it. A soft swishing sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate scrape, like a broom brushing across concrete. My chest tightened. Every muscle went rigid, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I tried to hold my breath to listen more closely, but my heart was pounding too loudly for me to pick out the noise clearly. Desperate not to lose my composure, I shuffled behind a tall rack of boxes, hoping to catch a glimpse without putting myself in direct view. My hands shook so much that the barcode scanner slipped from my grip, thudding onto the floor. The faint beep it emitted sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. When I peered around the corner of the crate, the corridor was empty, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. But the sweeping noise persisted, just out of sight. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to abandon the counting and deal with it in the morning when the building teemed with people. Yet something urged me forward. Maybe it was a misplaced sense of responsibility, or a burning need to confirm I wasn't imagining things. My chest felt tight as I moved quietly through the corridor, the scuff of my shoes echoing in the emptiness. The coldness of the concrete floor seemed to bleed through my soles, and my breaths came shallow, each inhale tinged with a stale smell that made my stomach clench. When I reached the end of the row, the sweeping noise stopped abruptly, cutting the air like a snap of tension. My pulse pounded, and a pulse of light from the flickering bulb made my surroundings blur for a split second. A shadow danced across the wall, but there was no one there. I stood paralyzed, a tingling numbness creeping across my arms. The silence that followed felt crushing, as though the warehouse itself was holding its breath. Moments later, I noticed footprints in the dust. They were faint but unmistakable, and they seemed to lead around the corner to another series of shelves. I swallowed hard, my throat drier than sandpaper, and forced myself to follow them. Each step felt like walking into a nightmare I had no way to wake from. My body felt on the verge of panic, heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might give out at any moment. Rounding that corner, I came upon another stretch of aisle. The footprints ended abruptly, with no sign of a retreating figure. A sense of unreality washed over me, like I was dreaming or trapped in some twisted version of reality. My vision swam, and I pressed my back against a metal rack to steady myself. A clang from somewhere in the distance made me jerk, sending a stab of panic straight through my chest. My breathing was ragged, throat constricting with terror. That was the tipping point. I gathered my courage, though it felt more like animalistic fear, and bolted back to my workstation. My hands trembled violently as I powered down the computer, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like angry hornets. I clocked out faster than I ever had and rushed to the exit. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a shock, and I realized I was drenched in sweat. My shirt clung to my back as I gulped oxygen, heart still hammering. From that night on, I did everything in my power to avoid being the last one in that building. I began scheduling my tasks so I could leave while others were still around. If the job demanded extra hours, I made sure to buddy up with someone. When asked why, I shrugged and mumbled that I didn't like staying alone in such a giant, empty place. Some co-workers smiled knowingly, but we all understood that certain corners of the warehouse seemed to harbor secrets we weren't prepared to confront. Despite these precautions, the sensation of being watched stayed with me. Even during the day, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. My heart would skip beats whenever I crossed that far corridor, and I often found myself hurrying past it without looking. Odd flickers in my peripheral vision continued to haunt me. At home, I struggled to focus on everyday life. I found myself checking over my shoulder in my own living room, half expecting to glimpse a spectral figure leaning out from behind a doorway. My paranoia had morphed into a constant companion, throbbing at the back of my mind. Over the next few weeks, I made small, subtle attempts to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. I set up my phone to record video during a closing shift, leaving it perched on a shelf aimed at the corridor. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, every second of it. Yet all I found were hours of static images of empty aisles. No flickering silhouettes, no phantom janitor. This only deepened my confusion, feeding the internal battle between believing my eyes and trusting technology. I remember one night, I awoke in a cold sweat after a vivid dream of that figure sweeping in glitchy loops right outside my bedroom door. The dream was suffocatingly real. My body jolted upright, my t-shirt drenched in perspiration, my heartbeat a wild staccato. I stayed up until dawn, lights blazing in every corner of my apartment, cursing my own overactive imagination. But was it really imagination? My mind circled that question like a predator around prey. As the weeks dragged on, the presence in the warehouse refused to fade into memory. It clung to me, overshadowing my thoughts. Some days I tried to rationalize it. A trick of the lights, stress, a small hallucination spurred by exhaustion. Other times, I felt certain something malevolent lingered there, trapped between walls of steel shelving and dusty crates. My spine would tense just thinking about it, as though a pair of ghostly eyes hovered over my shoulder. Eventually, I decided I had to face the darkness within myself as much as the literal darkness of that corridor. One evening, when only a handful of employees were left, I forced myself to walk to that back section. My heart pounded, but I wanted closure. The overhead lights flickered like they always did, casting ominous shadows. I waited there, letting the minutes tick by. The air was stale and cold. My eyes strained to see any shape, any movement out of place. My breath came shallow, but I stood my ground. Though nothing materialized that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed from some unseen vantage point. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and the longer I waited, the stronger the sensation grew. It felt like the darkness itself was pressing in, testing the boundaries of my courage. When I finally turned to leave, I felt compelled to glance over my shoulder. Of course, there was nothing to see, just rows of shelves receding into darkness, but a crawling dread lingered in my gut. By the time I returned to the main area, my entire body was trembling as though I'd sprinted for miles. I never found any definitive proof of a haunting, yet deep in my bones, I knew something existed in that warehouse that defied logic. It fed on quiet corners and dim light, weaving itself into the gloom where unsuspecting people might catch a fleeting glimpse. And though it never harmed me physically, it scarred my psyche in ways that might never fully heal. Even now, when the automatic lights switch off behind me and I feel the darkness closing in, my nerves spark with adrenaline, my heart thumps wildly, my mouth goes dry, and a thin sheet of sweat coats my skin. That figure, whether it's a restless spirit or a trick of my frightened mind, remains etched into my memory, replaying in slow, stuttering sweeps like a cursed recording. I can't unsee those jerky movements, the silent glide backward, the way it dissolved into dust as if it had never been solid. I still work in that warehouse, but I'm never alone at closing. I've made sure of that. The story might never have a neat explanation or a tidy resolution. The nature of fear, especially fear that toys with perception, seldom does. Each time I pass those dark shelves, the old dread slithers beneath my skin. That sense of being watched never left me. In some corner of my mind, I remain convinced that if I pause too long or linger at the edge of that corridor by myself, I might see him again, sweeping into endless loops, trapped in a glitch of existence. And that possibility is enough to keep my pulse racing, my hands unsteady, and my determination firm. I won't stand alone with the shadows. I can't, because even though I escaped that night, something in that warehouse still stares, still clings to the gloom, waiting for another chance to remind me that some things remain unseen only until they choose to reveal themselves again. I remember the sudden jolt in my chest the moment I realized we were well past the point of no return. There was no way to forget that sickening drop of my stomach, the tingling at the back of my neck, and the abrupt awareness that something was terribly wrong. The cockpit lights glowed in a familiar pattern, and the engine's low hum should have been comforting, yet an unseen tension hung in the air. Even before I saw that shifting form through the windshield, I sensed its presence. It was as if the darkness itself had clung to the fuselage, whispering warnings I couldn't decipher. My name is Thomas Mitchell. I've been training to become a certified flight instructor for several months now, logging hours in small single-engine planes on bright afternoons and calm evenings. The day it happened seemed unremarkable at first. My instructor, a seasoned pilot named Gray, had been praising my progress. He always stressed the importance of composure. A good pilot, he often reminded me, feels the plane as an extension of himself. But no amount of composure could prepare me for that surreal encounter. When we took off, the skies were clear. The weather forecast promised visibility for miles with no significant crosswinds. We intended to practice touch-and-go maneuvers, land, immediately power up, and take off again. It was routine, something I'd done dozens of times without incident. I remember the mild dryness in my mouth that morning, more from excitement than fear, and the faint smell of coffee Gray had spilled on the seat before we started. Nothing unusual, just the typical background details that fill a pilot's memory. The first sign of unease flickered through me shortly after departure. I heard a quiet popping on the intercom, like static searching for a frequency. I instinctively tapped my headset, thinking it might be a loose connector. Gray asked if I was okay, and I told him that maybe my headset wires were glitching. He shrugged and told me to adjust the radio. So I did. The static subsided, and I dismissed it as a minor technical glitch. Then we resumed our practice. We approached for the first touch and go smoothly. I noted the runway number, checked the instruments, and aligned the plane. Everything felt crisp and controlled. My heart rate stayed steady, though a hint of perspiration formed under my flight jacket. The aircraft responded to every control input as expected, until I glimpsed something from the corner of my eye. Out the front windshield, near the far edge of the runway, a hazy shape shimmered. At first it was merely a distortion, like when heat rises off tarmac and warps the air. But then it seemed to solidify. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart slammed against my rib cage. I could almost see an outline, like a veil swirling in the wind, except there was no wind strong enough to produce such an effect. Without thinking, I banked to the right, pulling the yoke hard enough that Gray snapped at me, alarmed. He demanded to know what I was doing, though in more urgent words. I could barely form a coherent answer. I told him there was someone, on the runway. But when I glanced back, that shape vanished into thin air as if it had never existed. Gray insisted he saw nothing. He calmly reiterated we should circle around and land properly, but the goosebumps on my arms refused to subside. I breathed in short, quick puffs, trying to calm myself. I could practically feel the blood pounding in my ears, mixing with the drone of the engine. Every muscle in my body tensed in confusion and dread. Had I imagined it? Was I losing focus? We prepared for another approach. This time I forced myself to keep my eyes straight ahead. My palms were slick with sweat on the yoke, but I managed to keep the plane lined up. We touched down gently and then began to power up for the takeoff roll when static drowned the radio again. A harsh screech tore through my headset. Then, the entire aircraft felt as if it had hit an invisible barrier. The fuselage rattled, the wings shuddered, and I fought to keep the plane centered. My vision blurred for a split second. I vaguely recall Gray cursing under his breath and checking the instruments. Everything read normal, yet the shockwave that rippled through the plane was unmistakably real. My stomach lurched as we ascended once more, the engine whining in protest. When we leveled off, Gray said we should head back and call the tower. He radioed in an acknowledgement, but the tower didn't mention any anomalies. I tried to maintain focus on the instruments, but I couldn't stop replaying that moment in my head, seeing that shape, feeling the air recoil around us. On our final landing, I felt my pulse hammering. My breathing was shallow, each gasp laced with anxiety. Once we touched the ground and rolled to the apron, I powered down. I remember my hand shaking as I fumbled to shut off various systems. The usual post-flight checklist felt like climbing a mountain, each step weighed down by lingering fear. I forced myself to appear calm for grace's sake, but inside, everything churned. We exited the aircraft, the late afternoon sun slanting across the tarmac. The ground crew greeted us, and I immediately asked if they had tracked another aircraft in our vicinity. They exchanged puzzled looks and shook their heads. One of them mentioned the sky was completely clear. No incoming flights on the schedule, no private planes unaccounted for. He said they'd noticed nothing out of the ordinary on radar. My gut twisted with dread. If there wasn't another aircraft, then what could I have possibly seen? I spent the rest of the day in a fog. My appetite vanished, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking whenever I replayed the flight in my head. My mind drifted to possibilities. Did I hallucinate? Was there a glitch in my vision? Or worse, did something beyond explanation cross the runway? That evening, I sat alone in the small apartment I'd rented near the airfield, trying to calm myself by reading aviation manuals. But the words floated past my eyes without registering. The overhead light buzzed annoyingly, and the hum seemed to grow louder the more I focused on it. My heart kept fluttering with residual anxiety, and each time I closed my eyes, I saw that shifting silhouette. In my peripheral vision, walls seemed to crawl with faint shadows. Perhaps it was exhaustion. I tried to ignore it, telling myself to sleep. But slumber didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant car passing on the road outside, every hiss of pipes in the walls made me jump. My breathing turned shallow again, and a sheen of cold sweat covered my forehead. It was as though my own home had become alien to me. I ran my hands over my face repeatedly, trying to rub away the tension gathering behind my eyes. Eventually, I collapsed into a restless sleep filled with half-remembered nightmares of radio static and flickering shapes. The next morning, I forced myself to face the day. I was due at the hangar for a maintenance briefing. The hallways smelled of engine oil and old coffee, as they usually did. But something felt off. Colors seemed more muted. The overhead fluorescent lights gave everything a sickly tint. I noticed reflections where there shouldn't be any, like a glimmer in the corner of a window that disappeared when I tried to focus on it. During the briefing, the maintenance chief explained the inspection schedule. I barely caught half of what he said because I was preoccupied with the faint hiss that persisted through the radio in the background. It was reminiscent of the static from the flight. An oppressive weight pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I could sense my pulse in my neck, a steady throb that refused to slow. I felt certain that if I listened hard enough, I'd hear that same screech from the day before, but it never came. It just hovered on the edge of hearing, taunting me with the possibility. Gray appeared near the end of the meeting and gave me a quizzical look. He asked if I was feeling okay. I mumbled something about stress. He nodded, saying I should take the day off to rest, maybe see a doctor if my eyesight was troubling me. I recognized the concern in his eyes, a worry that maybe I wasn't cut out for the rigors of flight if I was seeing things that weren't there. My stomach knotted at the thought of losing credibility, so I told him I just needed a good night's sleep. Determined not to let fear consume me, I went back to the cockpit later that afternoon, alone. I wanted to run a few simulations, study the instrument panel, remind myself of what was real. The plane was on the ground, safely nestled inside the hangar. The smell of metal, leather seats, and lingering fuel surrounded me in the enclosed space. Inside the cockpit, everything was familiar, the same controls, the same readouts. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of that jolt, that intangible presence we'd encountered. As I switched on the battery to test some readings, the overhead lighting flickered. My heart rate jumped instantly. For a moment I thought I caught a glimpse of that same distortion in the reflection of the cockpit instruments. I blinked, and it was gone. But the sensation of being watched intensified. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, as though something brushed my skin with invisible fingers. My breathing turned ragged, and my lips felt dry. I forced myself to look straight at the reflection again, but there was nothing there except my own pale face and wide eyes. I left the hangar feeling drained, uncertain if I was paranoid or if something genuinely lurked at the edges of my perception. Night fell quickly that evening, bringing with it an unsettling hush. The airfield grew quiet, except for distant hums of machinery and the occasional echo of someone's footsteps. I walked across the tarmac, scanning the darkening sky. Then, I heard a faint static crackle, like a radio left on somewhere in the distance. No one else seemed to notice. I approached an older radar technician, quietly asking if they were doing any unusual scans. He told me with a puzzled expression that everything was standard. No anomalies, no out-of-place readings. He asked if I was worried about something. I said I was just double-checking the radio frequencies. My voice trembled despite my best efforts to sound calm. The idea that nobody else heard or saw these disturbances made them more terrifying. If I was the only one aware, was it all in my head? Or was it targeting me specifically? In the days that followed, the tension heightened. I dreamt of flying through a void where the plane's instruments went haywire. In these dreams, that translucent figure appeared at the windshield again, except its features seemed more defined. I never made out a face, only swirling shapes that hinted at eyes or a mouth. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart hammered so violently that it took several minutes just to regain the presence of mind to understand I was safe in bed. Despite Gray's ongoing reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I brushed against something not meant to exist in our world. Every flight thereafter became a tightrope walk between composure and outright panic. Some days were manageable. I'd even forget the incident for hours at a time. But then a stray flash of sunlight on the windshield or a sudden burst of radio static would send my thoughts spiraling again. My paranoia grew. I started checking behind me in empty hallways, expecting to see a wavering silhouette. I avoided extended eye contact with reflections, fearing I'd see something behind me. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. Late one evening, I decided I needed to confront my fear head-on. I went to the airfield after most people had gone, armed only with a flashlight and a determination to prove to myself that there was nothing lurking. I needed to see the runway under the same conditions as before, to ensure my mind wasn't conjuring phantoms out of the night's shadows. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow across the deserted tarmac. The runway lights glimmered in the distance, a line of pale orbs stretching into the darkness. The air was colder than usual, and I could feel goosebumps under my jacket. My flashlight beam cut through the silence, illuminating patches of asphalt, the edges of the runway, the safety markers. I heard the distant hum of electricity from the floodlights, and my own breath sounded unnaturally loud in my ears. As I walked, the flashlight flickered. My heart jumped into my throat. The beam wavered, and in that split second, the lights along the runway seemed to warp and sway, as if something momentarily crossed between them and my line of sight. My hands started trembling, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I spun around, shining the flashlight frantically. Nothing. Just my own breathing echoing in my head. Then a crackling hiss erupted from the portable radio clipped to my belt. I hadn't noticed I'd left it on. Static roared, then subsided. In that brief moment, I felt the ground quake beneath my feet. Just a slight tremor, like a wave passing under the concrete. My stomach lurched, and for a moment, I almost toppled over. It was the same sensation as in the plane, that shockwave of impossible origin. My throat constricted, and I felt my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I tried to speak into the radio, but I couldn't form words. My voice seemed lodged behind a wall of fear. After a few ragged breaths, I managed to muster the resolve to check the space in front of me. The runway stretched out empty. No swirling shapes. No figures. Yet the sensation of being watched grew stronger, an invisible gaze pinning me in place. My flashlight shook in my hand, and I was certain if I lingered much longer, something would break through the veil separating it from me. Summoning what courage I had left, I turned around and walked briskly back to the hangar. My legs felt leaden, and each step echoed with the possibility of something pursuing me. The wind carried faint whispers, or maybe it was just the blood pounding in my temples. The entire time, I sensed that intangible presence, as if it hovered just outside my circle of light. Once I reached the hangar door, I practically stumbled inside, heart pounding so violently that I could barely think. In the days following this confrontation, I made a decision. I couldn't keep ignoring the possibility that I had encountered something far beyond my understanding. I spoke with Gray, indirectly explaining that I was struggling with unexplained experiences. He suggested I take a short leave to recuperate. I agreed, but deep down, I knew time away wouldn't be enough to banish my memories. The weight of what I experienced clung to me like a second skin. Yet despite the persistent dread, I realized one important thing. I was still here. The entity or force, whatever it was, hadn't torn me away or harmed me physically. That fact both comforted and unsettled me. It implied that maybe this presence was more about showing itself than destroying me. On my last night at the airfield before my leave, I stood at the edge of the runway once again, just to say a silent goodbye, or perhaps to test my nerve one final time. The sky was clear, and faint starlight illuminated the horizon. The runway lights gleamed steadily, a reassuring sight. As I gazed into the distance, I sensed the same hush, the same pregnant silence that always precedes an encounter. My heart started its usual frantic pace, but I steadied my breathing, fighting the urge to flee. Then, for just a moment, the runway lights dimmed, as if a mist or shadow passed over them. My muscles tensed, the air around me turned cold, and just like that, the lights returned to normal. No shape materialized, no shockwave rattled my bones. But I knew with absolute certainty, that whatever had crossed my path in the sky was still there, watching, existing just beyond my reach. An alien hush enveloped me, and I felt a lingering dread seep into my core. This was something out of our reality, a fragment of the unknown that decided to reveal itself. I left the runway that night with my nerves raw, yet strangely resolute. I wasn't sure if I'd ever find an explanation, but I accepted that I'd come face to face with something that defied logic. I didn't die, and I didn't vanish into the void. Instead, I carried that confrontation with me, etched into my mind. And though my hands still tremble at the memory, and my heartbeat still quickens at the faintest static buzz, I continue to fly. Because sometimes, the only thing more terrifying than facing the unknown is never knowing it was there at all. I first noticed the sound late on a Wednesday night, a high-pitched scrape that pierced the quiet and made my pulse hammer in my ears. It was the kind of noise that slithers under your skin and settles there, sending your nerves into a frenzied dance. I was alone in the house, standing in the hallway leading to the kitchen, and for a moment, I couldn't place exactly what I was hearing. Then I realized it was metal dragging across tile, slow and deliberate, as if something, or someone, was pushing it. I felt a deep twinge in my gut. There was no reason for any cookware to be moving, yet the sound persisted, echoing in my bones. In that instant, I sensed an oppressive weight in the air, a tension so thick it prickled every hair on my body. It was as though the house itself held its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. My nightly habit had always been the same. I cooked dinner late, usually after 9, and made sure to clean up afterward. I prided myself on leaving the kitchen neat, utensils in drawers, pots and pans stacked carefully. That routine gave me a sense of order. My life wasn't chaotic, and I wanted my living space to reflect that. But about a month ago, I started noticing small anomalies. A wooden spoon left on the counter when I was sure I'd locked it away, or a single pan found perched on the stovetop when I could swear I'd tucked it back into the cabinet. At first, I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Maybe I was just tired and losing track of my routine. However, those small disturbances escalated. I'd come into the kitchen each morning to find cookware moved around. Sometimes the pots sat in different cabinets. Sometimes the lids clanged to the floor in the middle of the night, startling me awake. The more often it happened, the more my mind swirled with possibilities. I tried to remain rational, telling myself it had to be some bizarre lapse on my part. But as days passed, those rational excuses grew less convincing. When I discovered fresh scratches on the kitchen tile, fresh enough for me to see faint white dust in the grooves, a chill ran down my arms. I knew something wasn't adding up. The tension coiled in my stomach like a serpent, striking every time I walked into that room. One particular night, I resolved to get to the bottom of it. I positioned myself behind the kitchen door, quietly waiting in the darkness. My heart pounded so forcefully that I could feel the beat in my throat. Every nerve in my body was on alert, sweat collecting under my arms and trickling down my forehead. After what felt like an hour, I started to question if I was simply paranoid. Then I heard it, the unmistakable screech of metal on tile. My entire body stiffened. I peered around the door, straining to see the pot or pan that must be moving. Sure enough, one of my pots was creeping across the floor as if an invisible hand were dragging it. The scratchy sound of metal against ceramic tile was nauseating, sending sharp vibrations right into my skull. It moved slowly, with agonizing purpose, leaving a jagged trail behind it. Then, as if meeting a final tug, the pot toppled over, smacking the floor with an ear-splitting clang. A sudden wave of dizziness struck me, like my body wanted to shut down from raw fear. In that moment, I could have sworn I heard a low, guttural chuckle emanate from the dark corner beside the fridge. My knees went weak, and a cold sweat dotted my brow. I groped for the light switch, flicking it on. Nothing. The kitchen was exactly as it should be, except for that pot lying on its side, rocking a little on the tile. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was vibrations from the street or some strange draft. But the laughter, or at least what I interpreted as laughter, haunted me. No matter how I struggled to push it out of my mind, the echo clung like a specter. Over the next few days, I grew hypervigilant. At night, I found myself jerking awake, convinced I heard pots scraping. Sometimes I'd step into the kitchen in the early hours of the morning and see a utensil resting on the floor, always in a slightly different spot. My reflection in the window looked pale and gaunt, as if I hadn't slept properly in weeks. After that unsettling experience, I decided to take action. I started locking all my utensils and cookware in a small storage room adjacent to the kitchen, a pantry with a sturdy door and a robust bolt. I told myself that once everything was locked away, whatever bizarre phenomenon was occurring would have no chance to manifest. The first night I tried it, I slammed the bolt shut with a sense of finality, as though I'd just sealed off whatever lurking presence had been tormenting me. But I couldn't block out the oppressive silence. Before heading to bed, I stood in my kitchen, scanning every shadow, waiting to see if something would defy my efforts. When nothing happened, I almost felt relieved. I slept slightly better that night, until a loud metallic crash jolted me awake around 3 a.m. My heart leaped into my throat. I nearly tumbled out of bed, hurrying to the kitchen with my pulse hammering so loud I could barely hear my own footsteps. When I reached the door to the pantry, I saw that the bolt was still in place, latched as firmly as I'd left it. Yet from inside came the chaotic clang of pots and pans banging against one another. It sounded as if someone were thrashing around, pulling each piece of cookware off the shelves and tossing them to the floor. The door vibrated, adding to the cacophony. Panic rose in my chest, strangling my breath. Despite the suffocating terror, I mustered the courage to unlatch the bolt. The moment I did, silence. A dead hush descended on the room like a smothering blanket. My stomach churned as I opened the door. Inside, the shelves were a complete mess, with pots scattered across the floor in haphazard piles, lids overturned, and utensils scattered in every direction. My mouth went so dry that I could barely swallow. No explanation made sense, yet the evidence was right before my eyes. Everything I had so carefully locked away was now in disarray, as though an angry intruder had ransacked the space, but there was no one else here. I stood in stunned disbelief for a few long seconds, then began collecting the kitchenware. My hands trembled each time I picked up a pot or pan, half expecting something to yank it away from me. Nothing did, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. My skin felt electric, tiny needles pricking the back of my neck. I put everything back on the shelves and secured the bolt again. All the while, my heart thumped so hard it ached. The next morning, I felt the weight of exhaustion bearing down on me. My head throbbed, and my eyes stung from lack of sleep. In a desperate attempt to cling to normality, I tried to go about my routine: shower, coffee, quick breakfast, then out the door. Even at work, I couldn't concentrate. It felt like the walls of my office were closing in on me, and I kept checking the time, dreading the moment I'd have to go back home. I remember overhearing a coworker remark that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't correct them, though I refrained from describing any details. I hinted that I was dealing with strange noises at night, possibly some kind of pest. The coworker suggested an exterminator, or an expert to check for problems in the house. I merely nodded, though I doubted an exterminator would find anything but cobwebs. When I returned home that evening, the house felt heavier. The air clung to me, thick with some intangible tension. As I stepped into the kitchen, a wave of dread coiled in my stomach. The pantry door was still locked, but the quiet around it felt unnatural, as though the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I contemplated unlocking the door just to check if everything was still in place. Yet I feared what I might find. Instead, I made myself a quick dinner, forcing each bite down while glancing repeatedly at that sealed room. The moment I finished, I locked away the plates in a different cabinet, one that wasn't in the pantry, just so I wouldn't have to open that door and see the chaos again. Trying to distract myself, I paced around the house, checking windows, scanning corners, making sure every door was locked. My movements felt mechanical, as if I were going through motions of false safety. That night, I slept fitfully, drifting in and out of a restless half-sleep. I was convinced I heard faint scratching sounds echoing from somewhere deep in the walls, followed by muted thumps that might have been real or imagined. My heart pounded so fiercely that I wondered if I was heading toward a breakdown. Over the following week, the disturbances turned more sinister in their subtlety. I began spotting shapes in my peripheral vision, a glimpse of a shadow darting across the hallway, or a sliver of movement near the stove, just as I turned off the lights. Each time I spun around, pulse racing, only to find nothing. My own reflection started to unnerve me. When I passed by the reflective surface of a pot or the dark window at night, I sometimes saw a flicker of something behind me, a faint outline like a silhouette. By the time I turned to look, it would vanish. The sense of being watched never left. It wrapped around me like a vice, gripping tighter with each passing day. The fear began to seep into my daytime life. At work, my hands shook when I tried to type, and a persistent sense of dread gnawed at my thoughts. I became jumpy and on edge. People asked if I was okay, but I couldn't give a coherent explanation. The phenomenon in my kitchen wasn't something I could rationally present to anyone without sounding unhinged. I told myself I needed proof, perhaps a recording. One night, I set up my phone on a makeshift stand in the kitchen, angled toward the pantry door, hoping to capture whatever might happen. I locked up the cookware as usual, feeling my muscles tense with each turn of the bolt. Then I shut off the lights and retreated to my bedroom, leaving the phone quietly recording in the darkness. That night, I dreamed of metal scraping. In the dream, I was surrounded by towering piles of pots and pans that clanked and shifted like living creatures. Each step I took sent them tumbling, creating a vicious din that made my ears ring. Something was hiding behind those piles, laughing in a low rumble that sent chills across my arms. I woke in a cold sweat, chest heaving and heart slamming painfully against my rib cage. My entire body felt clammy, and my breath came in ragged gulps. It took me a few seconds to realize the sound I was hearing wasn't just in my dream. A real scraping noise emanated from the kitchen again. Clutching my phone's backup battery like a lifeline, I forced myself to move down the hall. Every step felt like trudging through thick mud, my legs heavy with dread. When I reached the doorway, I froze. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by a faint street lamp glow that seeped through the window. My recording phone still sat on the stand, but the pantry door was wide open. Inside, the shelves were bare. Every pot and pan I owned was spread out across the floor. Some were upright, others overturned, forming a maze of metal that reflected dull orange light from the street lamp. My gut twisted at the sight. At first, I couldn't process how the door had unlocked. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. One pot, large and gleaming in the half-light, trembled. It was as if someone had just touched it. My heart thundered, and I braced for another unexplainable motion. Then, without warning, the pot jerked across the floor, sliding an inch or two with an echoing scrape. I let out a choked gasp, stepping backward. My feet stumbled over another pot, sending it clanging into the darkness. I fought the urge to slam the door and run, reminding myself that I wanted evidence. I reached for my phone on the stand, hoping it had captured the entire episode. The moment I lifted it to check the screen, the device shut off. The battery icon had been full before. Now it was completely drained. My throat constricted, and sweat dripped down my temples. That was impossible. Swallowing my fear, I turned back to the pantry. A wave of dizziness hit me, as if my mind rebelled against what I was seeing. Another pot moved on its own, scraping a path around the edge of the pantry as though it were circling the perimeter. The noise was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, only shriller and more visceral. My vision blurred with rising panic. I grabbed a flashlight from the countertop drawer. Its beam shook unsteadily across the floor as I tried to steady my grip. I wanted to find any rational explanation, but the scene defied logic. Closing my eyes for a second, I forced myself to breathe. In and out, slow and deliberate, I said in my head. Then, flicking the flashlight back on, I swept it over each wall, each corner. A thick tension hung in the air, almost suffocating, and I was convinced something was there, lurking, just beyond the reach of my light. My mouth went cotton dry as I realized I was cornered, trapped between the scattered cookware and the door. Tremors racked my limbs, and my heartbeat roared in my ears. I half expected to feel cold fingers on my shoulder, or see a hand close around my wrist. Instead, another pot slid, then another, the clanging intensifying until it felt like a deafening storm of metal. The flashlight trembled in my hand. My breath came in shallow bursts, chest burning. It was in that moment, with adrenaline spiking through my veins, that I made a decision. I darted forward, weaving through the metal obstacles, ignoring the screams of metal scraping around me. My only goal was to get out of that room. Somehow I managed to scramble past the pots and exit the kitchen. I slammed the kitchen door behind me, though deep down I knew a wooden door would do nothing to hold back whatever force was at work. My heartbeat wouldn't slow, and I felt my teeth chatter with adrenaline. Yet the noise in the kitchen subsided as soon as the door clicked shut, as if acknowledging my withdrawal. I stood there, gasping for air, every inch of my skin soaked in cold sweat. The house fell silent again, and that silence felt more suffocating than any racket. After a few agonizing minutes, I grabbed my keys. My legs wobbled, nearly buckling. I left the house, stepping into the cool night air under the streetlights. I got into my car, turned the ignition, and sat in the driver's seat with my heart pounding in my throat. My shoulders quivered from a blend of terror and exhaustion. For a long moment, I just stared at my front door, half expecting it to burst open on its own. Every nerve in my body told me to flee, but I couldn't quite bring myself to drive away. Eventually, I forced my trembling limbs to move, pulling away from the curb. I drove aimlessly, letting the hum of the engine soothe my frazzled mind. Around dawn, I found myself in a diner parking lot, hands still shaking on the steering wheel. The glow of the rising sun offered little comfort. I'd left my home in a panic, but I knew that ignoring the problem wouldn't make it disappear. A part of me wanted to return and confront whatever was there. Another part, though, wanted to throw my house key into the nearest gutter and never step foot in that place again. In the end, I decided I couldn't just abandon everything. That evening, I forced myself to go back. Stepping inside felt like stepping onto a precipice, but I noticed something strange. The kitchen was silent. and everything was somehow in place again. Even the pots and pans, which had been strewn across the floor, were neatly arranged on the pantry shelves. The door was secured as I'd originally locked it. It was as if the night's events hadn't happened, or as if the house itself had decided to erase the evidence, taunting me. I still live here, trapped in a cycle of tension and uneasy calm. The oppressive atmosphere never truly lifts. Most nights I lie awake in bed, straining to catch the faintest sound of metal against tile. Sometimes I hear a soft scraping noise. Sometimes it's only my heartbeat, pounding in anticipation of a threat that might or might not appear. I don't know what it is that shares my home. I don't know if it's a product of my own unraveling mind, or if a presence truly lurks in the shadows of my kitchen, deriving some perverse pleasure from tormenting me. All I know is that the house feels different now, like a living organism that breathes unease into every corner. My nights are spent in breathless vigilance, my days haunted by the memory of that scraping sound. I've tried rationalizing, tried ignoring, tried fighting back by locking everything away. Nothing works. In the dim glow of the evening, I sometimes imagine I see a faint figure reflected in the polished metal of my cookware, a shape with no discernible features except a hollow space where a face should be. But each time I blink or turn on the lights, it's gone. Yet the weight in the air remains, pressing on my lungs, forcing me to question my own senses. I haven't found a neat conclusion or tidy resolution. The fear has settled into my bones, and the unseen force continues to toy with me. Maybe I'll learn to live with it, to adapt to the reality of clanging metal and intangible laughter. Or maybe it'll push me past my breaking point, until the line between my imagination and the phenomena around me dissolves completely. For now, every evening, I stand by the kitchen doorway, heart thudding, half expecting to see a pot slowly sliding across the tile. And sometimes, in the silence, I still hear that soft metallic scrape, as though reminding me I'm never really alone. I remember the night the world turned green as if it were a fresh bruise throbbing in the darkness. My senses felt sharpened and raw, every nerve on edge, as though something had clawed its way into our reality and left its mark on my doorstep. Even now, thinking back to those first seconds, my stomach tightens with an inescapable sense of dread. There was no warning, no slow build toward the unnatural glow. It seized my surroundings in an instant, forcing me to witness a side of the night I never knew existed. And in the days that followed, the images only grew more vivid, more distressing. I still wonder if I truly witnessed something impossible, or if my mind betrayed me. But deep down, I suspect the truth. That reality sometimes slips open just a crack, enough to let something else creep through. I was on my back porch, barefoot and exhausted from another night of restlessness. My habit of late-night cigarettes was nothing new, a quiet ritual I used to calm the hum of anxious thoughts. The sky was otherwise dark, a half-hearted moon providing scant illumination. The houses in my suburban neighborhood were silent and still, as if everyone else had found a peace that perpetually eluded me. I remember taking the last drag, feeling the burn slip into my lungs, letting the warmth comfort me for just a second. Then it happened. A harsh flash of green, so sudden that my eyelids clenched shut on instinct. But even through closed eyes, I saw that glow in an intense shade that defied classification. Like radioactive fire, there was no source I could pinpoint. A ripple of heat slammed into me first, followed immediately by an icy chill. My legs nearly buckled, and the cigarette fell from my lips. My entire body trembled as if struck by a powerful current. The porch light above me flickered once and then stabilized. I remember gasping for air, my heartbeat thundering in my chest, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the glow vanished. It felt like standing in a silent vacuum after an explosion. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, my mouth gone dry with an inexplicable panic. My limbs shook so badly I nearly stumbled into the glass door. Struggling with the handle, I wrenched it open and flung myself inside. slamming it behind me with every bit of strength I had left. Inside, I collapsed against the kitchen counter, still trying to catch my breath. My shirt clung to my skin with sweat, and my mind raced in chaotic loops. For several minutes, I just stood there, my body pressed against the cool marble, hands gripping the edges so firmly my knuckles ached. The memory of that green flash, its intensity, the sensation of something passing through me, played over and over in my thoughts. It felt invasive, almost parasitic, like someone or something had forced an encounter. Finally, I summoned the courage to look out the window. The yard was dark again, perfectly mundane under the faint moonlight. I saw no sign of the phenomenon that had just assaulted my senses. I turned away, not trusting myself to interpret any strange silhouettes. That night, my restlessness turned into full-blown insomnia. My heart refused to settle into a normal rhythm, and my breathing was shallow for hours. The only reprieve I found was staring blankly at the ceiling, replaying each moment of that flash in my mind. I was desperate for a logical explanation. Perhaps a meteorite had flared overhead, or some freak electrical disturbance from the power lines nearby. In those early hours, logic was my only anchor. When the sun finally rose, I felt no relief. The daylight simply meant I had to go about an ordinary day under the weight of an extraordinary memory. It tormented me so quietly that I almost convinced myself nothing unusual had truly happened. For days, I tried to dismiss that night. I kept telling myself in half-hearted internal reassurances that some rare atmospheric event must have been responsible. But every time I passed the back door, I felt a twisting pressure in my chest. Curiosity and fear wrestled inside me. I couldn't bring myself to step onto the grass and investigate until one afternoon, when the guilt of ignoring it became overwhelming. Steeling myself, I slid open the door and walked to the edge of the yard. And there, in clear contrast to the surrounding healthy turf, was a near-perfect circle of scorched grass. It was just in front of the porch, right where I had been standing that night. The edges were burnt black, and the center looked as though it had been blasted by an intense heat. My stomach roiled, and a cold sweat formed along my temples. I had not imagined the event after all. In a daze, I crouched to run my fingers over the charred blades. The air around that patch of grass seemed a degree or two colder than the rest of the yard. My skin prickled in a crawling sensation, and every hair on my arm stood on end. I tried to think of some scientific rationale, a lightning strike maybe. Yet there had been no thunder that night, no storms reported, and lightning usually scorches in strange, branching patterns, not a precise circle. Doubt gnawed at me. My mind replayed the searing green flash, the rush of heat, then the freezing chill. I stood up and backed away, overwhelmed by the irrational certainty that I was trespassing on something forbidden. In the following days, the circle became an obsession. I'd peek through the curtains first thing in the morning and last thing at night, convinced it was changing in subtle ways. Early on, it remained the same in size. But soon, I noticed the ring's circumference looked more defined, almost as if it were growing sharper against the living grass. Late at night, I'd step onto the porch, heart hammering, half expecting that burst of green light to return. My breath would catch in my throat at the faintest flicker of movement in the darkness. Once, I nearly screamed at the sight of a passing raccoon's eyes reflecting the porch bulb. Paranoia was creeping in around the edges of my thoughts, and I was powerless to stop it. I avoided discussing it with friends or acquaintances in any serious way, afraid they would dismiss it as stress-induced delusions. When someone casually asked me how I was doing, I'd give them a forced smile and mutter something vague about insomnia or too much coffee, but never the truth. In my mind, I heard their voices suggesting rational solutions. A prank, a stray chemical spill from the lawn service, a hallucination. Yet every morning, that circle remained, mocking any attempt to rationalize it away. I toyed with the idea of covering it up, throwing fresh soil or laying sod over it. But each time I tried to summon the will, a trickle of dread hardened my resolve against meddling with whatever had created that mark. At night, I began to sense a presence lurking just beyond the circle. Nothing appeared to my eyes, but my instincts screamed there was something watching. A faint rustling among the bushes or the hint of an extra shadow slipping across the fence line would set my pulse racing. My palms would sweat, and my breath would catch in my throat. Standing in my living room, facing the yard through the sliding glass door, I had the impression something was quietly studying me in return. That intangible awareness sent chills through my spine, a near panic that flared without warning. I'd press my hand against the cool glass, half tempted to tear open the door and confront the emptiness, but I never dared. As more days passed, my nights became haunted by nightmares. I'd see a flicker of green behind my eyelids and dream of a twisting shape, featureless but oppressive, spreading across my lawn. In these dreams, I was paralyzed at the window, forced to watch as that entity emerged from the scorched circle, towering far taller than any human, its limbs contorting in ways that made no sense. The worst part was the sickening feeling that it recognized me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drumline in my chest. My mouth felt full of cotton, and my fingers trembled so violently I had to clasp them together until the tremors subsided. After each nightmare, I'd spend hours staring at the ceiling, consumed by the certainty that something had followed me out of sleep. Out of desperation, I tried to document the circle with photos and videos, but the images failed to capture the unsettling nature of that scorched patch. The pictures looked banal, a burned circle, nothing more. Even so, I forwarded them to a colleague who had some background in geology and asked, in a roundabout way, whether he recognized the pattern. He responded with typical professional politeness, saying it looked like some heat-based damage and might be related to fungal blight or a localized chemical reaction. His suggestions did nothing to settle my nerves. They felt too ordinary, too mundane for the raw panic I'd experienced. Yet I appreciated his effort. At least he didn't mock me outright. One of the strangest developments was the shifting quality of sound around the yard. Usually, on calm nights, I could hear crickets or the occasional hoot of an owl. Now, that background noise seemed oddly stifled around the perimeter of the circle. Whenever I ventured onto the porch, it felt as if the entire neighborhood had gone mute. No rustling leaves, no night birds, nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck would prickle, and my breathing became ragged, as if I were about to suffocate in the silence. The darkness itself felt heavier, as if pressed right up against me. A few nights later, I awoke with a start. My lungs burned, and I realized I'd been holding my breath in my sleep. My pajamas were soaked with sweat. I forced myself out of bed, half tripping over my own feet as I reached for the hallway light. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt, shadows etched deep under my eyes. It occurred to me I was beginning to mistrust every flicker of movement, every shift of light, convinced there was more meaning in random shapes than was truly there. Clutching the sink, I took slow, steady breaths until my heartbeat steadied. And yet, even then, I felt an irresistible pull toward the back of the house. Creeping into the living room, I peeked out the curtains. My pulse roared in my ears when I saw a faint shimmer of green at the center of the circle. It wasn't the same violent flash as before. Rather, it was a subtle glow, faint but unmistakable. My feet moved on their own, drawn by a surge of morbid curiosity. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I slid open the door and stepped outside. The silent air felt thick and suffocating. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and my breath quickened. From the porch, I stared at the scorched circle. The edges glimmered, giving off a pale green luminescence like bioluminescent algae, except it flickered erratically. A dull roar in my ears blocked out any rational thought. Every cell in my body rebelled against taking another step, but compulsion tugged at me to approach. My heart hammered so violently I worried it might burst. My hands shook, and a cold sweat slid down my temples, chilling my neck. Each step forward felt harder than the last, as if gravity were doubling beneath my feet. Standing at the edge of the circle, I felt a warmth radiating from the center, a heat that pulsed in tandem with my own heartbeat. It made my stomach lurch, as though I were leaning over a great height. An overwhelming urge to touch the ground almost overpowered me. There was a faint hum in the back of my skull, a vibration of unknown origin. I clenched my fists to resist. I didn't know if placing my hand on that charred earth would ruin me or let some malignant force inside. Eventually, I forced myself to retreat, stepping backward until I reached the porch. The moment I put enough distance between myself and the circle, the glow disappeared. Darkness swallowed the yard once again. My lungs felt like they might tear from the strain of my ragged breathing, and I had to collapse onto the porch chair, burying my face in my hands. My mind churned with the realization that something unexplainable lingered just beyond the boundary of normal existence, and it was fixated here, on my property. In the days that followed, I debated whether I should flee the house entirely, but I also felt that leaving would grant it some kind of victory, like abandoning my home to a lurking presence that had no right to be there. My anxiety became near constant, manifesting as trembling fingers and shallow breaths. I jumped at every creak of the floor or tap of the radiator. I began to question my own sanity. Perhaps I was descending into a nightmare of my own making. Yet the circle remained a testament to something tangible, a physical mark that defied all ordinary explanations. My final confrontation came one night as I stood by the window, gaze fixed on the darkened yard. The green glow returned, stronger this time. I felt a force pulling me forward, an insistent whisper in the corners of my mind. I remember telling myself in a harsh internal tone that I was done being controlled by fear. Without hesitation, I opened the back door and walked right up to that cursed spot. My whole body trembled, but I refused to stop. The circle gleamed like molten emerald, emanating waves of heat and cold in dizzying alternation. I forced myself to speak in a low, steady voice, though my words were more prayer than statement. I acknowledged the presence of something unknown, yet I refused to submit. My heart raced, sweat poured down my spine, and a chill wind brushed against my neck. I could feel invisible pressure on my skin, an unmistakable sensation that I was surrounded. My eyes watered from the intensity of the glow, but I stood there, refusing to turn away, letting it wash over me. After what felt like an eternity, the green light receded. It flickered once, and then the circle went dark. The air felt noticeably lighter, and I breathed in a sudden rush of relief. Whatever force had gathered there was either spent or had chosen to retreat. I collapsed to my knees, panting and dizzy with a strange combination of terror and triumph. My muscles felt weak as I stumbled back inside, uncertain if I had won anything at all, or if this was just a temporary reprieve. In the days that followed, I monitored that scorched patch relentlessly, waiting for the glow or the chill to return. Yet nothing else happened. Gradually, the circle remained just that, a patch of burnt grass that refused to regrow. Occasionally, I'll catch myself checking the sky at night, searching for any flicker of green that might announce a resurgence of that impossible light. My chest still tightens at the memory, and I can't stand on that porch without feeling the phantom heat and cold battling across my skin. I don't sleep well, and I still wake with an urgent need to look outside, expecting to see that unnatural shimmer dominating the yard. It's always dark, though, and silent, and if there is some presence lurking out there, it bides its time, content to let my racing heart and sleepless mind tear me apart from within. No explanation has ever satisfied me. Experts dismiss the burned circle as a minor anomaly, a curiosity without dire significance. I know better. Something crossed the boundary between the known and the unknown that night. It marked the ground in front of me and perhaps left a mark inside me as well. Even though the nightly glow has ceased, I feel changed, made more aware of forces beyond my comprehension. Sometimes, in the darkness before dawn, I think I glimpse a ripple in the air or hear a faint humming that resonates in my bones. Then a wave of crippling anxiety seizes me, and I'm forced to steady myself against the nearest wall. I go on living in this house, as though normalcy is just a matter of routine. But the memory of that electric green flash and the circle of scorched earth will forever cast a shadow over my thoughts. I've learned that certainty is fragile. Reality, as we understand it, can tear like thin fabric when confronted with phenomena we can't begin to explain. Every so often, I imagine that surge of brilliant light returning without warning, and an unspoken question forms in the back of my mind. Will I be stronger than it next time? Or will I finally be consumed by the fear? I've no desire to find out, but I suspect this is not over. After all, the evidence remains, etched into my lawn in a perfect, unyielding circle, a silent reminder that some boundaries are dangerously thin. And each night, I stand at the window, bracing myself against the cold fear that one day I might look out and see that dazzling green radiance once more, beckoning me into an unknown place where logic and sanity no longer hold any sway.